He threw the glass straight at her face, in front of the entire room. The whiskey streamed down her cheek, dripping onto the marble floor like diluted blood. No one moved. No one breathed. Because in the darkest corner of the club, the man all of Seoul feared was slowly setting the glass down on the table. No anger, no expression, just silence. A silence more dangerous than any gunshot. And that was the moment everything changed forever. For her, for him, and for the entire city of Seoul. Which city are you watching this story from? Please like and comment your city name below so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because this is just the beginning. The rain came sideways that night. Not the soft kind Seoul sometimes offered in late autumn, the kind that blurred neon into watercolor and made the Han River look like something out of a painting. This was different. This was the kind of rain that found the gap between your collar and your neck, that soaked through a borrowed dress before you'd even cross the street. The kind that felt personal. Arielle Baptiste stood at the service entrance of Club Obsidian at 9:47 in the evening, her compact held up in one hand, touching up the corner of her mouth with the other, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that the dress she was wearing belonged to her co-worker Soo Yeon, who was 3 inches shorter and 10 pounds lighter and had lent it without hesitation, which somehow made the whole thing more humiliating, not less. 29 years old, Haitian American, former architecture student at a university back in Chicago that felt, on nights like this, like a different person's life. She'd come to Seoul 2 years ago on a scholarship extension that fell apart after one semester, stayed because leaving felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit, and had been surviving ever since on contract translation work during the day and bartending private events at night. The debt wasn't hers, not originally. That was the part that still made her hands tighten around whatever she happened to be holding when she thought about it too long. She dropped the compact into her bag and pushed through the service door. The club hit her the way it always did, like pressure changing in an airplane cabin. Sound before sight, bass before beat. The ventilation system recycling expensive perfume and cigarette smoke, and something underneath both, something metallic and intimate that she'd never been able to name. Club Obsidian ran 3 floors below street level and occupied what had once been a private bank vault complex in the 1970s, and whoever had converted it into a lounge had kept the original steel-reinforced walls and heavy blast doors, reframing them as aesthetic choices, Art Deco brutalism, which Arielle had once found clever and now found simply oppressive. She checked in with the floor manager, a compact Korean man named Hyun, who communicated primarily through eyebrow movements, got her station assignment, center bar, private section, and spent the next 40 minutes setting up, stocking, and arranging herself into the particular version of herself that this job required. Efficient, quiet, invisible unless called upon. She was good at it. She'd had years of practice being invisible. The early crowd was the usual composition for a venue like this. Men in suits that cost more than her monthly rent. Women who'd learned to read rooms the way sailors read weather. Politicians from the Northern District offices who preferred basements to offices for the kind of conversations that didn't survive documentation. Finance people, property people, and threaded through all of it, present but never centered, the other kind. The men who wore their money differently, quieter, whose security stood a specific distance behind them with a specific quality of stillness that wasn't about muscle, but about certainty. She knew the type. She'd learned to recognize it. She served drinks for 2 hours and didn't think about anything except measurements and ice and the small physical rhythm of the work, which was the only thing that made the nights manageable. Her Korean was functional now, not elegant but accurate, which was enough for orders and enough for keeping her head down, which was all she needed. She almost made it. At 11:20, the main entrance doors opened and the room shifted. She felt it before she saw it. That particular atmospheric change when someone walked in who mattered. When the invisible social hierarchy of a room visibly rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. She was already looking up when she registered the voice. Make it a double, and tell them to put it on Cross's tab. Damien. The name landed in her chest like a fist through drywall. Damien Cross walked in wearing a charcoal Brioni suit and a confidence so performed it had become structural. The scaffolding holding up everything underneath. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with the particular handsome that photographs well and disappoints in person. The kind that revealed itself as architecture without interior design the longer you spent near it. She had spent 2 years near it. She knew every beam and hollow. He had investors with him. 3 men she didn't recognize, following his energy with the alert deference of people who had recently given money to someone and were still deciding if they'd been smart. And on his arm, literally draped there, one hand curled around his bicep, a woman in a red dress who was approximately 23 years old and had the specific quality of someone who had not yet learned that the things you accept in the beginning become the things you're trapped by later. Arielle turned her back to the entrance and very deliberately straightened a row of glasses that didn't need straightening. She was fine. She was at work. This was her job, and this was a building in Seoul, and she was an adult who had survived the actual disaster, not just the proximity to it, and she was going to get through one night serving drinks without Baptiste. His voice. Close. Closer than it should have been. She turned. Damien was standing at the bar with the expression she recognized most readily on him, the one that looked like warmth from a distance and wasn't. The investors had settled into chairs nearby. The woman in red was typing on her phone with studied disinterest. "I didn't know you were working tonight," he said. "I always work on Fridays." "Right." He glanced around the bar with that particular performative casualness that meant he was making sure people were watching. "How are you? You look—" He paused just long enough for it to be intentional. "Different." "What are you drinking?" "Macallan 18. Neat." He leaned against the bar. "I'm serious. How are you doing? I worry about you." She poured without looking at him. The bottle was familiar. The pour was precise. Her hands were steady, and she was proud of that, quietly, in a way she didn't have words for. "I'm fine," she said. "Are you still doing the translation thing?" "Yes?" "That's good. That's—" Another pause. "That's good for you. I think it suits you. Something manageable." She set the glass on the bar and looked at him directly for the first time. "Is there anything else?" Something moved behind his eyes. Something that didn't like being looked at directly. She'd named it, after enough time, as a specific kind of anger that lived in men who'd spent years being managed instead of confronted, who'd learned to receive deflection as normal and found eye contact from certain people intolerable because it removed the comfortable distance they required to operate. "Actually," he said, "there is something. Damien, the Yongsan project, the financial bridge. I sent you the co-signer paperwork 3 weeks ago, and you never responded." The room continued around them. Ice clinked. Conversations flowed. The bass moved through the floor in slow cycles. "I'm not signing anything for you," she said. "It's a formality. It's paperwork. I'm not signing anything for you," she said again. The same way, same volume, same temperature. His jaw tightened. The warmth in his expression didn't disappear. It was too practiced for that. But it cooled around the edges like a fire running low on fuel. "You still have debt under your name," he said quietly. "From the Mappo arrangement. I was going to include a clause to— Don't. Clear that when the project clears escrow, which would actually help you, but if you want to be difficult about it— Damien." She kept her voice flat and even and very quiet. "I know what the Mappo arrangement was. I know how my name ended up on it. And I know that if I sign anything connected to the Yongsan project, I'll be holding debt for something I have no stake in when it collapses. Which it will. Because it always does." The temperature around him dropped about 10 degrees. One of the investors, the one in the gray suit, the one who'd been listening with the particular alertness of someone whose money was involved, looked over. "Everything all right?" he asked, in the direction of Damien. "Fine," Damien said. He picked up his glass, smiled. The warmth came back, performed, and complete. "Old friends." He walked back to the table. She exhaled once through her nose and went back to work. For 45 minutes, she thought it was over. Then the second wave started. Small, at first. He'd catch her eye from across the room and shake his head with a little smile, the kind that said he found her refusal charming in the specific way you find a child's argument charming. Not seriously, but with tolerant condescension. Once, when she was delivering a round to a nearby table, he said something in English to the investors. She caught the word stubborn and then she used to be different. And she kept moving and didn't react and felt the adrenaline hit her bloodstream like cold water. At 12:40, Damien stood up from the table. She knew the stance, shoulders slightly forward, chin at a specific angle, the 4 or 5 whiskeys working on whatever restraint he'd arrived with. He came back to the bar. "You told Jong-soo I was behind on the Sinchon repayments," he said. No warmth now, just accusation, direct and raw. "I didn't tell anyone anything." "Someone did, and the only person with that information. I haven't spoken to Jong-soo in 4 months. Then how did he—" "I don't know, and it's not my problem." She didn't look up from the glass she was cleaning. "You should go back to your table. Look at me when I talk to you." She looked up. "There you are," he said, and his voice had that edge now, the one she'd spent years learning to navigate around, the one she'd only recognized as dangerous in retrospect, after she was already outside it. "You're angry." "I'm working." "You're angry because I moved on. That's what this is." "Damien, you wanted me to chase you. You thought if you said no to enough things I'd come crawling back, but that's not how it—" "Stop. That's not how grown women act, Arielle. And I've been trying to be patient with you tonight, but you need to understand that what you did, going to Jong-soo, going behind my back, I didn't do anything to you." Her voice came out harder than she intended. "I didn't sign your paperwork because I don't trust your paperwork. I didn't contact Jong-soo. Whatever is happening with your project is happening because of your project, not because of me. And whatever story you're telling yourself right now so you don't have to—" His hand closed around her wrist, fast, hard. The words stopped, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the shock of it, the sheer blunt physical fact of a hand that had no right anymore closing around her arm like it still did. "Let go," she said. "You ruined it," he said quietly. "You know that? You could have signed one piece of paper. That's all it would have taken. And instead—" She pulled. He didn't let go immediately. Then he did. The glass she'd been holding hit the floor. Not dramatically. No slow-motion arc, no cinematic shatter. It just tipped from the bar where she'd set it when he grabbed her and hit marble in a flat, hard burst that cut through the nearest conversations like a stone through water. Heads turned. Then more heads. Then the bar area went quiet in expanding circles. People reading the body language of 2 people standing 3 feet apart with a broken glass between them and something unmistakable in the air. Damien straightened. He glanced at the investors. The woman in red was watching now, phone lowered. Something in him made the decision. She saw it happen, saw the moment he chose. He picked up his glass, the fresh whiskey she'd poured him 15 minutes ago and hadn't touched, and he threw it in her face. The amber liquid hit her in a wave. Cold first, then burning slightly at the cut on her cheek she hadn't noticed until now, where a fragment of the earlier broken glass had nicked her. It ran down her jaw, soaked into the borrowed neckline of Soo Yeon's dress, dripped from her chin onto the floor. She didn't move. Not because she couldn't, because some part of her brain went to a very quiet, very cold place and simply stopped. The room had gone completely still. The music was still technically playing, but it felt distant now, irrelevant, like background noise in a building where something structural had just given way. 30, 40 people in the immediate area, not one of them moving. The bartender 2 stations down stood with a bottle in hand and didn't pour. The waitress near the east wall had stopped mid-step, tray level, just watching. Damien said something. She could hear his voice, processed it dimly as just a lover's argument, and a short, nervous laugh that landed in the silence like a rock dropped into a still pool. Nobody responded. Nobody looked at him. They were all looking at the same place. She became aware of it gradually. The shift in the room's attention, the way certain bodies, the security, the men near the walls, the floor manager Hyun, who had been moving toward the bar, had all stopped and oriented themselves toward a specific point in the room, the far booth. She turned. She had walked past that booth twice during setup and hadn't thought about it, partly because it was set back from the main floor in a way that made it feel separate, partly because whoever sat there was never the loudest presence in the room, partly because she'd learned to not look at things she sensed she shouldn't look at directly. The man in the booth had been there since before she arrived. She'd registered him at some peripheral level, Still, expensive suit, alone, except for two men standing at a distance that wasn't close enough to be conversation and too close to be coincidence. She'd filed him under "not my concern" and moved on. Now she looked. He was looking back. Korean, late 30s, maybe 40, tall. She could tell even seated. Dark suit, no tie, one button open at the collar, a single black glove on the left hand that struck her as deliberate in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. His face was the kind of compose that takes years to build. Not natural stillness, but trained stillness, the kind that costs something to maintain. A glass of something dark sat on the table in front of him, untouched, his right hand resting alongside it. He had been watching, not with horror, not with discomfort, with the particular quality of attention that preceded a decision. He picked up the glass, set it down. And then, in the silence of a room that was still processing what had just happened, Kang Min-jae spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Lock the doors." The sound was immediate, but magnetic locks all around the perimeter, snapping shut with a low, heavy thud that traveled through the floor and up through the feet of everyone standing on it. The kind of sound that couldn't be misread. Every secondary exit, every service door, the main entrance. Sealed. Damien turned toward the sound and something left his face. Not color, something deeper. The architecture. The music died. Completely. Not faded. Cut, like someone had pulled a cord. The remaining ambient noise of the room, ice, conversation, the distant sound of the kitchen, all of it thinned into nothing. What was left was the sound of air conditioning and approximately 40 people breathing with unusual care. Kang Min-jae stood up. He was taller than she'd estimated. He crossed the floor of Club Obsidian with a particular quality of movement that she would think about later and have trouble describing accurately. Not hurried, not slow, with the economy of someone for whom all motion was purposeful, who had stopped doing things without reason sometime long enough ago that it had become physical habit. The room didn't part for him dramatically. People simply became aware of his trajectory and adjusted. He stopped in front of her, not in front of Damien. Her. He looked at her face with the same quality of attention he'd had from across the room, not evaluating, not performing concern, just looking the way you look at something you're trying to accurately understand. "You're bleeding," he said. His English was precise, accented, but specifically so, with the cadence of someone who had learned it from multiple sources and welded the results together. She brought her hand up to her cheek. Her fingers came away with a thin red smear she hadn't registered until this moment. The glass, earlier. The fragment she hadn't noticed. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded handkerchief, black, cotton, pressed into a perfect square, and held it out to her. Not theatrically, just held it out. She took it. The fabric was heavier than she expected. The room was watching this with the particular intensity of people who understood they were observing something they would be talking about for a long time. Damien cleared his throat. "I appreciate the concern," he started, "but this is really a private—" "Sit down," Min-jae said, not looking at him when he said it. Damien's mouth closed. Then Min-jae turned slowly and looked at Damien for the first time. And Arielle, pressing the black handkerchief against her cheek, whiskey drying on her jaw, standing in her co-worker's dress in the middle of a locked underground club in Seoul, watched the most visibly confident man she'd known in 2 years physically take a step backward from the weight of being looked at by this particular pair of eyes. "You thought that gave you permission," Min-jae said. It wasn't a question. Damien opened his mouth. She could see him cycling through options, arrogance, humor, deference, appeal, running through his usual arsenal and finding, perhaps for the first time, that none of it had traction. "She's my ex," he finally said. "We have history. This is—" "Sit down," Min-jae said again. Same tone, same volume. Damien sat. The investor in the gray suit was already on his feet, very quietly collecting his jacket from the back of his chair. The other two followed. None of them said anything to Damien. They didn't need to. The geometry of the room had spoken. Min-jae turned back to Arielle. Up close, his face had a quality she hadn't expected. Not hardness, exactly. Something more specific. the particular stillness of a man who had made a very large number of decisions over a long period of time and had learned to live with all of them. There was something exhausted about it, very deep, the way you can see exhaustion in old stone. "What is your name?" he asked. "Arielle." He nodded once, as though confirming something. Then he turned back to the room, and what happened over the next hour felt less like justice and more like a very precise surgical procedure, conducted in public, without anesthetic. Min-jae did not shout. He did not threaten. He asked questions about the Mapo arrangement, about Yongsan, about specific dates and amounts, and the name of a banker in Gangnam who had processed certain transfers. And each question landed in the room like a depth charge, slow fuse, and Damien's answers, the ones he gave and the ones he withheld, each of them detonating something. She learned things she had half known and not let herself fully know, the debt in her name, how it got there, the documents she'd signed thinking they were lease agreements, the account in Busan she'd been told was closed, the investors didn't come back. The woman in red left through the kitchen, escorted by one of Min-jae's men, which apparently meant she was considered collateral and not culpable, a distinction that Arielle thought distantly, said something about how these people organized their thinking about guilt. Damien held on for a long time. She'd give him that. He had a specific kind of tenacity, the survival instinct of someone who had talked his way through a lot of rooms and believed, functionally, in the infinite renegotiability of reality. He argued, he reframed, he tried sympathy, not toward Arielle, toward Min-jae, man to man, as if there were a version of this conversation in which they were peers. Min-jae listened to all of it with the same quality of attention, patient, complete. The way you listen to something you have already decided about, because getting the full information matters even when the conclusion is already reached. Then Damien made his mistake. He looked at Arielle, who had been standing against the bar this entire time, the handkerchief held to her cheek, watching, present but not asked to speak. And his voice went somewhere raw and ugly and specific, the place where men go when they have run out of maneuvers, and what remains is just the pure distilled thing underneath all the performance. "She's nobody," he said. "She's a bartender. She's a nobody that I gave years to and who threw it." He didn't finish the sentence. Not because anyone stopped him, because the room changed. Min-jae had not moved. He was still standing in the same position, same posture, same composed expression. But something behind his eyes shifted in a way that was visible even from across the room, even through the imperfect lens of Arielle's exhausted and alcohol-stung vision, something that moved through his face like a signal through a circuit, fast and irrevocable. He took 3 steps toward Damien, slowly, precisely. The way you move when the decision is already complete and the physical act is simply its execution. He stopped close enough that Damien would have been able to smell the sandalwood in his jacket. "You threw a drink at a woman to feel powerful," Min-jae said, quietly, with something in it that was worse than volume. "That tells me exactly how small you are." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Then Min-jae straightened and gave 3 instructions to the man standing near the main circuit box, each one delivered in Korean with the flat specificity of someone reading from a list he had already prepared internally. Banking access? Severed. Business protection within Black Lotus territory? Withdrawn. Every financial and social connection that Damien Cross had cultivated inside the city's underworld over the past 4 years, gone, as of the following morning, as completely and permanently as if it had never existed. In another city, this might have been a business setback. In Seoul, in this world, it was a sentence. Damien understood that. She could see the understanding arrive in him, the way comprehension of something irreversible looks different from comprehension of something negotiable. His hands, which had been resting on the table with performed casualness, pressed flat against the surface. His breathing changed. "Please," he said. Just that. Min-jae was already turning away. He turned toward Arielle. "Do you want him removed?" he asked. The question took a moment to process. Not the words, the implication behind them, the fact of being asked. The fact that in a room controlled by a man who controlled a significant amount of this city, the decision about this was being placed with her. She looked at Damien. He was looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Stripped of everything. The charm and the architecture and the performance, all of it gone, leaving just the small and frightened thing underneath that had always been there, and that she had spent 2 years mistaking for depth. "No," she said. "I want him to live with it." The answer seemed to land somewhere unexpected in Min Jae. She couldn't have said exactly how she knew. He didn't smile, didn't react visibly, but something shifted in the still water of his expression, some small acknowledgement. He gestured to Hyun, who had been standing at the edge of the room for the past hour, like a man not entirely sure which version of his job description applied to the current situation. The magnetic locks disengaged. The doors opened. People left. Damien left. He didn't look at her again. She thought that might have been its own answer. The room emptied over the following 20 minutes, staff and guests filtering out with the particular quiet of people who had witnessed something significant and were processing it privately. Hyun caught her eye once and gave her a look that communicated something between apology and bewilderment, and an acknowledgement that whatever had just happened was going in a mental file he was going to revisit for years. She stood at the empty bar. The whiskey was mostly dried on her dress and jaw. The cut on her cheek had stopped bleeding but pulled faintly when she moved her face. The borrowed dress was ruined. Min Jae was standing near the far booth, speaking quietly with the two men who had been standing with him all evening. He glanced toward her once during the conversation, then away. Then the two men left, and it was just the two of them in Club Obsidian. Her at the center bar, him near the far booth, 40 feet of empty marble floor between them and the music still off, and the locked doors now unlocked and the whole room breathing differently in the absence of everyone who had filled it. He walked toward her. "There's a first aid kit upstairs," he said. "The cut should be cleaned." She looked at him. "Why?" she asked. He stopped. "Because it's a cut," he said, "and you've been pressing a handkerchief against it for an hour." "That's not what I mean." He seemed to consider this, then, "I know." And he waited. The most feared man in Seoul standing in an empty club at 1 a.m, waiting for a bartender in a ruined dress to decide what she wanted to do next. And the quality of the waiting was patient in the specific way of someone who had learned patience the hard way, who had sat with discomfort long enough that he no longer fidgeted inside it. She shouldn't go upstairs. She knew that. She knew it the way you know when something is about to change the shape of your life. When the next decision you make is going to be a dividing line you'll spend years measuring everything else against. She thought about the empty apartment she'd go back to, the translation work on her desk, the debt in her name, Soo-yeon's dress. She looked at him. "All right," she said. She followed him toward the private elevator at the back of the club, and when the doors closed behind them and the car began to rise, she had the distinct and particular sensation of crossing a threshold, not back and not forward, but somewhere adjacent to everything she had believed her life was composed of. The elevator opened on the penthouse floor. She stepped out. And then she heard it. Not music, not voices, not the sound she would have expected from a man who owned this building and everything in it. Silence. But a different kind of silence than the one downstairs. The kind that isn't empty. She turned and looked at the room, minimalist, spare, warm-lit, a record player in the corner with a vinyl sleeve propped against it, tea steeping in a glass pot on a low table, a window running the full length of the exterior wall showing Seoul at 1 a.m, burning wet and orange and impossibly alive 14 floors below. No guards, no weapons visible, no performance. Just a man standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at a city he owned pieces of in ways that most of the people in it never saw or understood. She realized, standing there in a ruined dress with a cut on her cheek, that she had absolutely no idea what happened next, and that for the first time in longer than she could immediately remember, neither did he. The penthouse was the kind of quiet that accumulated over years. Not designed quiet, not the engineered silence of soundproofing and thick carpets, though it had both. Something older than that, the quiet of a space that had been occupied by one person for a long time, that had taken on the specific character of that person's habits, and that registered the presence of a second person the way a room registers a new piece of furniture. Not hostility, just the subtle recalibration of spatial geometry. Arielle stood just inside the elevator threshold for a moment longer than she needed to. Old habit. Architecture school had trained her to read rooms before entering them, to understand load-bearing elements and sight lines and the way light moved through a space before committing to being inside it. She'd lost most of what the program had given her, scattered it across 2 years of survival mode decisions, but that particular reflex had stayed. What she saw: a single open floor, roughly 1,200 square feet, ceilings high enough to breathe in. The far wall was entirely glass and entirely Seoul at 1 in the morning. The Han River dark and glittering below the Mapo Bridge. The Yeouido towers burning white against low cloud cover, rain still dragging itself sideways across the city in long diagonal sheets. The furniture was sparse and deliberately chosen. A low platform sofa in charcoal linen, 2 chairs facing the window, a reading lamp throwing a warm circle on the floor near a stack of books that were clearly being read and not displayed. The record player she'd noticed was a vintage Technics in the far corner, the vinyl sleeve propped against its base showing an album she didn't immediately recognize. The tea service on the low table was simple. Glass pot, 2 cups, the steam still moving. No art on the walls. None. Just the city. Min-jae had his back to her still, standing at the glass. She set her bag on the floor near the elevator and walked to the bathroom she found off the left side of the main room. It was as spare as everything else. No products cluttering the counter, a single bar of soap, 1 folded towel on the rack that hadn't been used. She found the first aid kit under the sink exactly where he'd said it would be. A flat aluminum case that was stocked with the thoroughness of someone who had needed first aid in places where calling a doctor wasn't an option. She cleaned the cut on her cheek with antiseptic that stung sharply and briefly, pressed a thin strip of closure tape across it the way the kit's contents logically suggested, and then stood at the mirror for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The woman looking back at her had whiskey in her hair and mascara that had traveled south. The borrowed dress had a stain across the bodice that wasn't coming out. She was 29 years old, and she had spent the last 2 years rebuilding herself out of whatever Damien Cross had left her after 2 years of a different kind of erosion. And tonight someone had thrown a drink in her face in a room full of people. And what she felt, standing in the bathroom of a penthouse belonging to a man she'd met 90 minutes ago, was not what she would have predicted she'd feel. Not broken, not humiliated, just very, very tired. And underneath the tired, something else. Something small and persistent and not entirely comfortable. The same thing she'd felt when he handed her the handkerchief without theater, when he asked what she wanted instead of deciding for her, when he'd stood close enough to Damien that Damien physically flinched and then simply spoken the truth about him in plain language without decoration. She didn't have a word for it yet. She wasn't sure she wanted one. She came back out. Min-jae had moved from the window. He was at the low table near the sofa, pouring tea into both cups with the specific unhurried attention of someone for whom the act was not performative but habitual, the kind of care that means you do it the same way when no one is watching. She sat in the chair closer to the window. He set a cup on the table near her without comment. She looked at it. Then she picked it up. It was oolong. She hadn't tasted oolong since a woman in her Chicago neighborhood used to leave it on the building's shared landing for anyone who wanted it, a small gesture of community in a building full of graduate students who were all drowning in their own particular ways. The memory arrived and departed in the same second. "You knew," she said. "Before tonight, you already knew about the accounts." He settled into the other chair. He'd removed the black glove at some point. She noticed the left hand now, bare, and saw the scar that ran from the base of his index finger across the knuckle to his wrist. Old scar. Whatever had made it had been serious and had been a long time ago. "I knew the accounts existed," he said. "I knew who held them. I didn't know you were the one bartending tonight until you were already here." Coincidence. Seoul isn't a large city, not the part of it that matters. She considered this. "You were there to meet someone." "I'm always there to meet someone." "Who?" He looked at her with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite assessment, some third thing she didn't have an immediate category for. "Someone who won't be meeting with me again." She let that sit. Outside, the rain moved across the glass in slow rivers. "How long have you known about Damien?" she asked. 18 months. The number landed oddly. "That's before I knew." "You knew," he said. "You just hadn't let yourself finish the sentence." She wanted to argue with that. She found, pressing on it, that she couldn't. She looked at her tea. The Busan account. Opened 14 months ago. Your national identification number. His signature under a power of attorney document that a notary in Mapo has since had difficulty locating. The careful precision of that, the bureaucratic anatomy of how someone takes apart your life and builds something with the pieces that serves only them, sat in her chest like swallowed glass. How much? She said. Enough that it would take you years to surface from it on a translator's salary. She exhaled once, slow, through her nose. Why are you telling me this? Because you should know the actual shape of what happened to you, he said. Not the version you've been told. And what do you get from that? He looked at her steadily. Nothing. That's not how this works. In your world, that's not... No, he said. It's not usually how it works. The honesty of that stopped her. They sat in the particular silence of two people who have both said something true and are living with the weight of it. She asked, because the tea and the late hour and the exhaustion had stripped her of whatever social editing she'd normally apply. What happened to you? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. He picked up his own cup, set it down without drinking. I was 24, he said. I had a partner, someone I built the early structure of everything with. I trusted him in the specific way you trust someone when you've survived things together. The kind of trust that doesn't feel like trust anymore because it's just the air you breathe. She waited. He sold information to a rival organization. 13 people died. 4 of them were mine. A pause. One of them was 17 years old and had been working for me for 3 weeks because he needed money for his mother's medical bills, and I had thought he was safe in the position I put him in. The weight of that number, 13, moved through the room. What happened to your partner? Min-jae's expression didn't change. He's no longer a consideration. She didn't ask for elaboration. She understood the grammar of that sentence. So you closed everything off, she said. I built what needed to be built. You can't run an organization of this size on sentiment. You can't run a life on the absence of it either. The words came out before she'd finished deciding to say them. Direct. Slightly too direct. She felt the edge of them as they landed. He looked at her. Not with offense. With something more careful than that. No, he said quietly. You can't. Something shifted in the room after that. Subtle and structural, the way a change in barometric pressure shifts a room before a storm arrives. Not visible, but felt, in the skin and the back of the throat. She became aware of how close the chairs were, how late it was, how the city outside continued its wet and indifferent burning, while inside everything had gone very still. She should go. She knew she should go. She had a translation deadline on Monday, and a landlord who needed 3 months back rent by end of the month, and a coworker whose dress she'd ruined, and a life that was not this penthouse, not this window, not this man in this chair looking at her with the particular quality of attention that felt like being the only thing in a room. She didn't go. The record player started on its own, a timer or a habit she didn't understand, and the vinyl in the corner began turning, and what came out was something old, a slow jazz thing she half recognized, trumpet over brushed percussion, the kind of music that made late-night rooms feel like the only real place in the world. He stood and walked to the window. She stood and walked to the window. They stood side by side, looking at Seoul, close enough that she could feel the warmth off him, close enough that when he turned slightly to look at her profile, the distance between them was no longer the distance of strangers. You didn't have to do any of that tonight, she said. No. So why? A silence. Because everyone watched him humiliate you, he said, and I realized I couldn't. Not couldn't allow it. Couldn't. Personal, first person. The distinction was small and vast simultaneously. She turned her head. He was already looking at her. Later, she would not be able to say with any precision who moved first. Later, she would think it was less like a decision and more like a pressure that had been building since the elevator, since the handkerchief, since the moment he'd asked what she wanted in a room full of people who had only ever decided for her. When he kissed her, it was careful at first. The kind of careful that means the opposite of cold. That means the person has trained themselves not to reach for things and is reaching anyway, and knows the cost of that and is doing it anyway. She kissed him back. His hand came to the side of her face, not covering the cut, careful of the cut, and she felt the warmth of his palm against her jaw and the whole architecture of the past 2 years. The debt, the loneliness, the slow process of letting someone convince you that diminishment was love. She felt it begin to loosen at the joints, not fall apart, just loosen, the way ice fractures before it breaks. Then his phone rang. Not the regular phone. A different one. Smaller, matte black, kept in a separate inside pocket. The one she would later learn was never ignored. The sound cut through the quiet of the penthouse with the specific authority of something that had been designed to be impossible to ignore. He broke away. Not with reluctance, with the automatic response of a man who had trained himself to answer certain sounds the way the body responds to a fire alarm, before the conscious mind has finished processing the stimulus. He looked at the screen. His expression did not change. That was how she knew it was serious. When the things that would change anyone else's face changed nothing on his, it meant the information was being processed in the place underneath expression, in the cold architecture where decisions actually got made. He answered in Korean, short sentences. The person on the other end spoke for approximately 40 seconds while Min-jae listened in the quality of silence she was beginning to recognize. Not passive silence, active silence. The silence of someone absorbing information and simultaneously calculating its implications. He said 3 words, hung up, turned to her. "You need to leave," he said. Not cold, not unkind, but the penthouse had shifted again, back to something else. The warmth compressed under something operational, and the man who had been standing at the window with his hand on her face was still technically present in the room, but was no longer the dominant version of himself. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing that involves you." "You said that like you're not sure." A fraction of a pause. Too short to mean nothing. "A rival organization has made a move. It's being managed." "By who?" "By the people I pay to manage it." She looked at him. "What did you say when you answered the phone just now? 3 words. What were they?" He met her eyes. "They know already," he said. She processed that. The grammar of it. The pronoun. "They know about me," she said. Not a question. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. "The car downstairs will take you wherever you need to go," he said. "My driver will—" "How would they know about me? I've been here for 2 hours. I'm a bartender. I'm nobody." The word left her mouth, and she heard it land and recognized immediately what it was and where it had come from, the echo of Damien's voice in the room below, and the recognition of it moved across her face before she could stop it. Min-jae watched that happen. Something tightened briefly in his jaw. "You're not nobody," he said, "and that's the problem. Meaning that I acted publicly tonight, in a room that contained a significant number of people who have reasons to track my behavior. And the way I acted indicated something." His voice stayed level, but there was an edge beneath the level, something pressed down. "About what you mean to me, or what they believe you mean to me." The room was very quiet. "And what do I mean to you?" she asked. The question hung there, between them and the city and the rain and the still-turning record in the corner. He looked at her for a long moment, with something in his face that she couldn't fully read, something that moved behind the trained stillness the way weather moves behind mountains. You couldn't see it directly, but you could read the pressure of it. "Something I didn't account for," he said. It wasn't an answer. It was something more complicated than an answer, and she understood, from the specific quality of his discomfort in saying it, that for a man who had spent 15 years accounting for everything, it was the most honest thing he was capable of at this particular moment. The elevator opened. She hadn't pushed the button. 2 men stepped out, the same men who had been standing at a distance in the club below. One of them looked at Min-jae. A single glance, loaded. 5 minutes, Min-jae said to them. In English, for her benefit. They stepped back into the elevator. The doors closed. He turned back to her, and what she saw now was not the man from the window, the careful, briefly unguarded man who had poured tea and told her the truth about the number 13. What she saw was the other version, the one that had stood in the club below and spoken 3 words that sealed the building. Both of them were real. She was starting to understand that about him, that the 2 versions weren't contradiction, were in fact the same person operating across different registers of necessity. "I'll have the financial documentation regarding your account sent to a lawyer I trust," he said. "Discreetly, you'll have options. I don't want your—" It's not charity, it's cleanup. The accounts were opened in your name inside Black Lotus territory using methods that required someone inside my organization to not notice. Someone was paid to not notice. I don't leave that kind of mess." She absorbed this. "And that's all this is," she said. "Cleanup. Arielle, just say yes or no." A long beat. "No," he said. She looked at him. "No," he said again, quieter. "It's not all this is." The elevator returned on its own, the soft chime of it cutting through the room. The doors opened. The 2 men were not in it. It was empty, sent back up for her, a silent logistical suggestion that the moment had reached its operational limit. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it near the door. She walked to the elevator. She stopped in the threshold. "The rival organization," she said without turning. "How serious?" "Manageable." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Serious enough that I need you somewhere they can't reach you." She turned then, looked at him across the length of the penthouse, across the low table with its cooling tea and the window with its burning city and the record still turning in the corner, still producing its quiet brass suggestion of something warmer than either of them had been prepared for. "And if I don't want to be somewhere unreachable?" she said. His face did something complicated. "Then you're making a decision you can't unmake," he said. She thought about that. She thought about the borrowed dress, and the translation deadline, and the landlord, and the weight of every manageable, sensible, self-protective decision she had made over the past 2 years that had amounted to not enough, and not enough, and not enough. She thought about a man pressing a black handkerchief into her hand in the middle of a locked room. "Tell me the name of the organization," she said. The silence that followed stretched long enough to be a different kind of answer than the one he eventually gave. "The Pale Crane," he said. She'd heard the name. Everyone who'd spent enough time in the rooms she'd been working in had heard the name. Not in detail. In the way you hear the name of a storm system on the horizon, in weather reports filed by people who knew how to read radar and were warning people who didn't. "And they know about me," she said, "as of approximately 30 minutes ago." "How?" He looked at her with the expression of a man measuring something. "Someone in this building," he said. "Someone I trusted with access to this floor." The sentence arrived in the room and detonated slowly, the way the important things always did, not with sound but with the particular quality of silence that comes after a structural failure, when the building is still standing but something load-bearing is gone and the whole shape of the thing has changed irrevocably, and everyone present understands that what comes next is not a matter of if, but only of when. That was where part 2 had ended. Not a word but a hinge. The kind of sentence that doesn't finish, because finishing it would require committing to a shape of reality that nobody in the room was ready to hold yet. Arielle stood in the elevator threshold and watched Min Jae's face. He was looking at the floor near the low table, not at her. At a specific point on the floor, the way people look at things that aren't there when they're running calculations that don't have clean answers. His left hand, the scarred one, had closed into something that wasn't quite a fist. The record in the corner had reached the end of its side, and the needle was cycling through the let-out groove, a soft, rhythmic scratch that was the only sound in the room. "Someone on this floor," she said. "Yes." "How many people have access?" 4, including the 2 men in the elevator. He paused. "Including the man who manages this building's security systems." "Yun." He looked up at her then. Not confirmation, not denial. Just the quality of attention that meant she'd landed somewhere real. "He was the last person down there," she said, "after everyone else left. He was standing at the edge of the room the whole time, watching." "He's always watching. That's his job." "Then it could be him." Min Jae was quiet for 3 seconds. "It could be. Or it's one of the 2 men who were just standing in this elevator." Another silence. Longer. Yes, he said. She looked at him. You don't know which one? Not yet. She let the elevator doors close without stepping in. She didn't make the decision consciously. Her feet simply didn't move, and she recognized the choice in that non-movement the same way she'd recognized it upstairs, as the kind of thing the body decides before the mind has finished its argument. Then I'm not going anywhere in a car driven by someone you don't trust, she said. Something moved across his face, brief and complicated. The driver isn't on the access list for this floor. That's not what I said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the matte black phone again, dialed without looking at the screen, and spoke 4 words in Korean she didn't understand. Hung up. There's a secondary exit, he said. Street level, service corridor. I'll take you down myself. And then what? And then you go somewhere safe. You keep saying that. Safe where? Safe how? You just told me someone inside your organization sold information about me to the Pale Crane 30 minutes after I walked into your penthouse. I've been in Seoul for 2 years. Nobody has ever given a damn about me. And now in the space of one night, I've become a liability for the most dangerous man in this city. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. I need to understand what I'm walking into. Not a version of it. The actual shape. He set the phone on the table. He sat down on the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, and she recognized from the geometry of the posture that it was not casual. It was the posture of someone setting down a weight they'd been carrying in a particular way for a long time and deciding, with deliberate intention, to set it differently. The Pale Crane Syndicate has been operating out of Incheon for 11 years, he said. They move product through the port, chemical precursors primarily. They've been trying to expand their territory into Seoul for 6 years, and I have been the primary reason they haven't been able to. How? Banking relationships, political relationships, 3 specific judges and a deputy minister in the transportation office who find it in their professional interest to maintain the current arrangement. He looked at his hands. The Pale Crane's leadership changed 14 months ago. The previous head was practical, understood boundaries. The current one is 31 years old and grew up watching his father's organization get contained by mine, and what he feels about that is not professional. It's personal. Everything with him is personal. His name, Seo Junho. She filed the name. And he found out about me how? Someone told him. Min-jae's jaw tightened fractionally. Someone in this building with access to this floor who was in this room tonight or monitoring it remotely, who understood what it meant when I crossed the club and handed you that handkerchief. He paused. I don't make that gesture. I haven't made that gesture in 15 years. Whoever told Junho knew that, knew what it signaled. The implication of that sat between them. So whoever it is, she said slowly, they didn't just sell him information. They sold him an interpretation. Min-jae looked at her with something sharp and briefly surprised. Yes. They told him you care about me. They told him I might, and that's enough for him to move. For Junho? A breath, almost a laugh, entirely without humor. That's everything. She walked back into the room. Not to him, to the window. Seoul continued outside without opinion. She pressed her fingertips against the glass and felt the cold of it and the vibration of the rain against the outer surface, a faint trembling transmitted through the material. You need to find out which one of the 4 it is, she said. Tonight, before Junho has time to act on whatever he was told. Yes. How long does that take? Depends on the person. She turned from the window. I want to be there. No. Min-jae. No. Flat, final, but not cruel. Not because I don't trust your judgment, because if I'm trying to read someone and you're in the room, I'll be watching you instead. The honesty of that stopped her argument before she could form it. She exhaled. Then what do I do? You wait, he said. Here. The secondary elevator requires a biometric key that only I have. The floor is... His phone buzzed. The regular one this time. He looked at the screen and something crossed his face that she hadn't seen there yet. Something fast and ugly and immediately controlled, like a wound covered before you can fully see the depth of it. He stood. Stay here, he said. Don't open the elevator for anyone. What happened? Stay here. He was already moving toward the elevator, jacket straightened, phone in hand, the operational version of himself fully assembled and moving with the focused velocity of someone for whom urgency had become a specific physical register. I'll be back within the hour. The elevator doors closed. She stood in the penthouse alone. The record needle continued its soft circuit in the lead-out groove. The tea on the table had gone cold. Outside, Seoul burned and rained and didn't care. She sat down in the chair by the window and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and let herself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, the full accumulated weight of the evening. The whiskey on her face, the cut on her cheek, the way Damien's voice had sounded when it scraped bottom and what it had found there, in this room, and the man who had been in it with her, and the specific terrible mathematics of how something she hadn't been looking for had arrived in the worst possible context, and was now embedded in a situation she didn't fully understand and couldn't extract herself from cleanly. 60 seconds. Then she put her hands down and looked at the room. She was an architecture student. She was a translator. She read documents for a living. Not just language, structure. The way information was organized, what was present and what was conspicuously absent. She stood up and started looking at the room properly. Not searching, reading. The books near the lamp, Korean legal texts, 2 books on organizational theory in Japanese, a worn copy of something in French she couldn't read, and underneath them, a flat leather notebook. She didn't open the notebook. She noted its position, not hidden, not displayed, left with the casual placement of something referenced regularly. The record player, the album sleeve propped against it was a Blue Note pressing, Art Blakey, mid-60s, the kind of record that cost real money to own in original pressing. She checked the label on the spinning side. It was original. He hadn't bought it for display. The second room off the main floor, she'd assumed it was a bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. It was an office, not the kind of office that performed power. No massive desk, no display of organizational hierarchy. A working office. 2 screens on a low desk, both dark. A physical wall-mounted board to the left covered in what appeared to be organizational charts rendered in a precise hand with colored thread connecting nodes. The kind of thing you made when you needed to see relationships that software couldn't capture with enough granularity. She stood in the doorway and looked at the board without touching anything. The structure of the Black Lotus Syndicate, rendered in ink and thread. She wasn't looking for information. She was looking at the quality of the thing, at the mind that had made it, the level of detail, the connections that had been revised, thread-pulled and restrung, the ghost marks of earlier configuration still faintly visible on the board's surface. Someone had been building and revising this map for years. Someone who trusted nothing entirely, who kept the full picture only in one place, in their own hand, because the alternative was distributing knowledge and distribution was risk. The kind of person who built that board was exactly the kind of person an infiltrator would need to get close to carefully. Over a long time. Through trust accumulated in increments too small to measure individually. She went back to the main room. She sat down and thought about what Min Jae had said. 4 people with access to this floor. The 2 men. Hyun. And a 4th he hadn't named yet. She thought about the timing. 30 minutes after she'd arrived on the floor, that was when the call came. 30 minutes wasn't long. It was the kind of response time that meant whoever made the contact had done it the moment the information was available without deliberation, which meant either they were very professional or they were very motivated, and professional people deliberated. Motivated people didn't. She was still running this through when the elevator chimed. She stood up fast. The doors opened. It was not Min Jae. It was one of the 2 men from before, the slightly taller one, the one who had stood to the left in the elevator. He stepped out into the penthouse with the specific quality of controlled movement that she had learned tonight to read as operational, as opposed to casual, and he was alone. And Min Jae had said the floor required a biometric key that only he had. "Mr. Kang asked me to check on you," the man said. In English, accented but clear. He said nobody was coming up. "There's been a development. He wants you moved." He said he'd be back within the hour. Plans changed. The man took 2 steps into the room, His hands were loose at his sides, which was not the same as relaxed. "There's a vehicle waiting at the secondary exit. I'll take you down." She looked at him. She was standing near the window, which put the full width of the room between them. "What's your name?" she said. "Park." "How long have you worked for Min Jae?" A fractional pause. 7 years. "What did he say to you on the phone just now, specifically?" Another pause. Longer. The quality of the room shifted in that pause, something tightening in the air between them, and she recognized the shift because she had learned to read Damien Cross across 2 years, and the particular quality of a person recalibrating mid-conversation because the script wasn't running the way they'd expected. "He said to bring you down," Park said. "He doesn't know my name," she said. Park looked at her. "Min Jae, when he called you just now, he would have said, 'Bring the woman,' or 'Bring her.' He doesn't know my name." She paused. "So what exactly did he say?" Park moved. Fast, faster than she'd prepared for, crossing the room with the efficiency of someone trained for exactly this kind of small space engagement, closing the distance before she'd fully processed the decision to run. His hand closed on her arm above the elbow, and the grip was not Damien's grip, not the grip of anger or performance. It was the grip of someone who had done this before and knew how much force was required and applied exactly that amount. "Don't," he said, quietly. "I don't want to hurt you." "Then let go." "Come downstairs, that's all." "Whose car is at the secondary exit?" Silence. "Min Jae's?" More silence. She had her answer. She stopped pulling against his grip, which surprised him. She felt it in the fractional loosening of his hold, the micro-adjustment of someone recalibrating for resistance that didn't come, and she used that fraction to drive her free elbow backward into his ribs, not with full force, but with the compact, targeted pressure she'd learned years ago from a self-defense workshop in Chicago that she'd attended because a friend asked her to and that she had never, in 8 years, expected to use. It wasn't enough to free herself. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to move him 2 inches to the left, which it did, which meant when she drove her heel down onto his instep, she had the angle she needed, and that one connected with enough force that his grip broke. She was already moving toward the office. She didn't have a plan beyond the next 10 seconds. The office had a door with a physical lock. She'd seen it when she pushed it open. Interior lock, the kind that required no key from the inside. She cleared the main room in 4 steps and hit the office door and slammed it behind her and threw the lock and stood with her back against it, breathing. Park's shoulder hit the door once, solid, testing, then nothing. That was worse. She looked around the office. The 2 dark screens, the wallboard with its colored threads. A second door on the far wall she hadn't noticed before. Narrower, the kind of door that led to a utility space or a secondary stairwell. She crossed to it, unlocked. She pulled it open onto a concrete stairwell, bare bulb, the kind of functional space that didn't exist on the architectural plans of a place like this, that had been added or repurposed by someone who understood that beautiful buildings needed ugly exits. She took 3 steps into the stairwell and stopped. Min Jae was coming up. He took in the situation in the space of 1 second. Her, the stairwell, the open door behind her, the specific quality of her breathing, and the way she was holding herself. And his expression contracted into something hard and immediate. "Park," she said. He was already past her. She followed him back through the office door, which was no longer locked from the outside. The lock had been defeated in the time she'd been in the stairwell, not with noise, but with the quiet application of something specific to the mechanism, and into the main room. Park was standing near the window. He looked at Min Jae with an expression she would think about later. Not guilt, not defiance. Something more tired than either. The expression of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally been relieved of the pretense of not carrying it. 7 years, Min Jae said. "Yes," Park said. "Sit down." Park sat. Not because he was afraid. She didn't think, watching it happen, that he was particularly afraid. He sat the way people sit when they have moved past the phase of the situation where action matters and have entered the phase where only words are left. Minji stood in the center of the room. He hadn't looked at Arielle again after that first assessment. His full attention was on Park, and the quality of it was the specific quality she had seen in the club below when he'd stood in front of Damien. Not anger, not heat, but something colder and more patient. The attention of someone who would take as long as necessary. "The call you made was at 11:43, Min-jae said. 11:43. I looked at her across the room at 11:41. 2 minutes. You didn't wait to see how the evening would develop. You called the moment you saw me stand up." Park said nothing. "That means you weren't reporting an event. You were reporting a pattern, something you'd been watching for, something Junho asked you to watch for specifically." "Min-jae, how long has he had you?" Silence. "Park." The name landed like a flat stone. "How long?" Park exhaled. "Long." Through his nose. He was looking at the floor, at that same point near the low table that Min-jae had looked at earlier, and she thought distantly that the floor of this penthouse had absorbed a significant quantity of difficult truths in the past 2 hours. 3 years, Park said. The number hit the room. 3 years. While standing 2 steps behind Min-jae at every meeting, every negotiation, every moment of exposure. 3 years of access to this floor. 3 years of proximity to the wallboard in the office, the organizational structure of the Black Lotus Syndicate rendered in thread and ink. 3 years of being trusted with the back of a man who trusted almost nothing. Min-jae didn't move. She watched his face for the impact of it and saw almost nothing. A single contraction of the muscles around his jaw, a fractional tightening around his eyes, quickly smoothed. But she was watching closely now, and she had been watching him closely since the club, and she saw underneath the smoothing the actual shape of it. Not surprise. Not betrayal in the way betrayal feels when it's new. Recognition. The recognition of a thing he had suspected and not confirmed and had been living with the suspicion of. She could see it in the way his shoulders released slightly. The specific relief of a person who has been waiting for a particular bad thing to become definite and can finally stop waiting. "What did you give him?" Min-jae said. "The Gangnam banking routes, the Yongsan contacts, the names of the 3 judges." Park paused. "The deputy minister." The last 2 items landed in the room with different weight than the first 2. She could see it in Min-jae. The banking routes and Yongsan contacts were operational loss. The judges and the deputy minister were structural, the difference between losing a revenue stream and losing the political framework that had kept the pale crane out of Seoul for 6 years. "When?" Min-jae said. "The judges, 8 months ago. The minister, 4 months ago." "Does Junho have documentation?" Park looked up for the first time. "What?" "Does he have documentation of their arrangement with me or only names?" "Only names." Something in Min-jae's posture recalibrated minutely. Not relief exactly. The adjustment of someone revising a damage assessment downward by 1 category. "And tonight?" Min-jae said. "You called him when you saw me stand up." "Yes." "What did you tell him?" "That you had identified someone, that you had crossed the room for her, that you had—" Park stopped. Glanced at Arielle once, briefly, then back to the floor. "That you had done things I had not seen you do before. In public." "And what did he say?" Park was quiet for a moment. The quality of the quiet was different from his earlier silences. Less withholding, more something he was deciding how to carry into words. "He said it was exactly what he'd been waiting for," Park said. Min-jae stood very still. "He said you'd made yourself human," Park continued, his voice dropping slightly. "He said that's always how it ends. Someone makes themselves human, and then they can be reached." The record in the corner had stopped its cycling scratch at some point while she wasn't paying attention. The room was completely silent now, except for the rain against the glass. Arielle looked at Min-jae. He was looking at Park, but she could see the side of his face, the angle of his jaw, the particular configuration of a man absorbing the confirmation that the thing he had spent 15 years preventing, the particular vulnerability of being human, of being reachable, had been announced to his worst enemy on the night it had finally, accidentally, happened. Announced by a man he had trusted for 7 years, 3 of which that man had spent as an instrument pointed at him. "Where is Junho now?" Min-jae said. "I don't know." "Park." I genuinely don't know. He doesn't tell me location. He calls me. I report. That's the structure. When does he call next? When he has something to tell me. Or when he wants a status? Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Your phone. Park reached into his jacket and removed a phone. Not the phone she'd seen him use before, a second one, slimmer, prepaid by the look of it, and held it out. One of the other men, who had appeared at some point in the doorway behind Min-jae without her noticing, crossed the room and took it. Take him downstairs, Min-jae said to the man. The east room. Wait for me. Park stood. He looked at Min-jae once more before the man steered him toward the elevator. The look was not apologetic. She'd expected apologetic, and what she saw instead was something more complicated, something with grief in it but not guilt. The look of a person who had made a decision years ago that they understood at the time would end in exactly this room and had made it anyway for reasons that were still their own. The elevator took him down. Min-jae stood in the center of the empty penthouse. He didn't move for a moment. She watched him stand there in the middle of the room that had been, 2 hours ago, a place of unexpected and brief quiet. And she watched the city work on him through the window, the wet orange light of Seoul painting one side of his face while the other stayed in shadow. And she thought she understood something about the exhaustion she had seen in him earlier, the deep structural exhaustion. This was what it cost to build a world entirely out of controlled distance and then have someone reach through it and have that reaching immediately weaponized. This was the tax. He turned. He looked at her with eyes that were very tired and very clear and very present. The pale crane will move tonight, he said. Not tomorrow, tonight. Junho has been waiting for this specific piece of information for 3 years, and he now has it, and he is 31 years old, and he feels things rather than thinks them. What does moving look like? It looks like a summit, a forced negotiation, under the pretense of a territorial dispute so that the other organizations in the city, the ones who maintain neutrality, have cover to stay out of it. He paused. He'll want you present, not harmed, present, as leverage, as proof that he can reach what I care about. That's assuming he can get to me. He already tried tonight. A beat. Park was the soft version, the version that was supposed to be clean. Now that it's failed, the next version won't be. She looked at him. Then you need to move first. Yes. Call the summit yourself, on your terms, before he can set the conditions. Min-jae looked at her with the particular quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as the version that meant she had landed on something real. That requires a location, he said. Neutral ground, something both sides will accept. You have 3 judges and a deputy minister, 2 of whom Junho now has the names of. The third one he doesn't. Min-jae was quiet. And you have banking relationships and political relationships that Junho knows exist but can't move against quickly because he has names without documentation. She was thinking out loud, the architecture student part of her mind mapping load-bearing elements and stress points. He needs this summit to produce something visible, something that justifies what he's been doing for 3 years. An abstraction isn't enough. He needs you diminished in a way the other organizations can see. Yes. Which means he needs the summit more than you do. A pause. Which means you have conditions he has to accept, she said. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain had shifted direction again, moving against the eastern face of the building now, a low, steady percussion against the glass. Then his phone buzzed, the matte black one. He looked at the screen. His face did the thing, the fast, controlled processing of information that didn't reach expression. But this time it reached his eyes, in the specific way it had reached them when he'd read the first message. And she watched the calculation run and watched the answer land, and knew before he spoke that whatever the message said, it had changed the geometry of everything that had just been planned. Junho isn't waiting for a summit, Min-jae said. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. A photograph. Grainy, taken with a long lens through rain. A parking structure. She recognized the distinctive angular facade of the building on the corner as somewhere in Yoido, the financial district. 2 men standing near a vehicle, one of them in profile. The man in profile she didn't recognize. The man facing the camera, The one looking up toward the lens as if he'd sensed it, wearing an expression of alarm that had arrived approximately 3 seconds too late, was Hyun. "Your floor manager," she said. "My floor manager," Min-jae confirmed. "Meeting with Seo Jun-ho's second in Yeouido 20 minutes ago." She stared at the photograph. "Park wasn't the informant," she said slowly. "Park was an informant." His voice was very quiet. "Not the only one." The shape of it arrived in full. Not one person. Two. Running parallel. Feeding different information, possibly unaware of each other, or possibly, and this was the colder possibility, the one she could see Min-jae processing in real time, possibly structured deliberately, two independent lines into the same organization so that if one was discovered, the other remained intact, and the discovery of the first would create the illusion of a solved problem. "He let you find Park," she said. Min-jae's jaw tightened. "Jun-ho let you find Park," she said again, hearing it as she said it, the architecture of it becoming clear in the saying. Park was the decoy. Park calls in the moment you stand up, obvious enough to catch, fast enough to confirm suspicion. You find Park, you think you found the leak, and meanwhile Hyun has already transmitted everything else. Not just tonight, the full picture, the judges, the minister, your banking structure, the organizational map, and he's been doing it for longer than 3 years. And the only reason you're seeing him in that photograph right now is because Jun-ho is done being subtle. The room was very quiet. Min-jae set the phone down on the table. He stood with his hands at his sides, and she watched him stand there with the full weight of it. Not just tonight, not just Park, but the 3 years that had preceded tonight, every meeting and decision and adjustment made on the basis of organizational intelligence that had been simultaneously flowing out of his building through a second channel he hadn't known to look for. And she watched him absorb it with the specific quality of a person who has been hit by something serious and is running a rapid internal assessment. What still works? What doesn't? What can be rebuilt and what is simply gone? What she saw, watching that assessment run, was not a man breaking. It was a man who had been broken before and knew what it felt like and knew what came after it. He turned to her. "The summit location I can still control," he said. "The third judge is clean. If I move in the next 2 hours..." "Min-jae," she said it quietly. "Hyun has the organizational map." A beat. "He has the board from your office. Everything you've been building for 15 years. Jun-ho has it." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She watched him understand what she was saying, not just the tactical implication, but the full one. That the structure he had built in the aftermath of the last betrayal, the architecture of controlled detachment and operational precision that had been both his protection and his isolation for 15 years, had been mapped and transmitted to the person most motivated to dismantle it, and the summit that he was planning to call on his terms was a summit that Jun-ho would walk into already knowing the location of every load-bearing wall. "Then I have one advantage he doesn't know I have," Min-jae said. She looked at him. "What?" He looked back at her, and what was in his face was not the operational version, not the controlled version, but something that existed underneath both of those. Something she had glimpsed at the window an hour ago, and that had been briefly, catastrophically visible to everyone in a room 40 floors below when he had... "You," he said. She looked at him. "He knows about the judges, the minister, the banking routes, the organizational structure." Min-jae's voice was very quiet and very precise. "He doesn't know about you, not what you are, not what you think like. He knows your name and your face, and that I handed you a handkerchief, and from that he drew a conclusion about leverage." A pause. He drew the wrong conclusion. She understood what he was saying. She also understood that she should disagree with it, that the intelligent, self-preserving response was to tell him that she was a translator and a bartender, and that whatever he was about to suggest, she was not equipped for it, and he needed to find another variable. She didn't say that. "What do you need?" she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up the matte black phone and made 3 calls in the space of 4 minutes. Each one short, each one in Korean, each one with the flat specific authority of a man issuing instructions that would be followed without question and understood without repetition. When he finished, he looked at her. "Can you drive?" he said. "Yes." "Manual transmission?" "Yes." "I need you to listen to everything that happens tonight and tell me afterward what you heard that I didn't." He paused. "Not tactics, not threats. The emotional logic. What people want underneath what they're saying." "You're asking me to read the room." "I'm asking you to read people I can no longer read objectively because they've been inside my organization and I've been looking at them as instruments rather than as people, which means I've been looking at them wrong, which is exactly the error Junho has been counting on." The honesty of it landed clean. "All right," she said. He nodded once. "Change out of that dress." She looked down at herself. The whiskey stain. The ruined hem. Into what? He went to the bedroom, which she still hadn't seen, and returned with a folded black sweater and a pair of dark trousers that were too large for her but had a drawstring waist. Practical. Not a gesture. She took them without comment and changed in the bathroom while he made a fourth call, and when she came out, he had his jacket back on and a second phone, different from both the regular one and the matte black one, in his inside pocket, and he was standing at the office doorway looking at the wallboard with the colored threads for what she understood, from the quality of the looking, was probably the last time he would look at it as it currently existed. "How much of it is compromised?" she asked. "Most of the operational layer, the banking relationships can be rebuilt through secondary channels. The political relationships..." He stopped. "The judges will distance themselves the moment they sense instability. That's the nature of that kind of arrangement. And the minister? The minister has more to lose than I do if this becomes visible. He'll hold." "You're sure?" "Reasonably." "That's not the same as sure." "No," he said. "It's not." They went down through the service stairwell, not the elevator. 14 floors of bare concrete and industrial lighting that she descended quickly and without complaint while Min-jae moved ahead of her with the efficiency of someone who had used this exit before and recently. At the bottom, a door opened onto a narrow alley behind the building, rain still coming down but lighter now. The kind of rain that had been going for hours and was running out of conviction. A car was waiting. Not a town car, a gray sedan, mid-range, the kind of vehicle that disappeared in Seoul traffic. A man she hadn't seen before was standing beside it. Min-jae spoke to him briefly in Korean, and the man handed over the keys and walked away without looking back. Min-jae got into the passenger seat. She got behind the wheel. The engine turned over on the first try, a solid four-cylinder with better response than the exterior suggested. She adjusted the mirror, the seat, checked the gear pattern, and pulled out of the alley into the side street. "Where?" she said. "Mapo Bridge. Cross to the north side. I'll direct from there." She drove. Seoul at 2 in the morning had its own particular logic. The large arteries still moving, the smaller streets emptied down to the occasional cab and the delivery scooters that the city ran on around the clock. She merged onto the Riverside Road heading west and felt the car respond to the conditions, the wet asphalt and the slight crosswind off the river. And she focused on the driving the way she'd learned to focus on work, by reducing everything to the physical immediate. The next 10 meters, the next decision, everything else moved to a background process. Min-jae was on the phone beside her, Korean, low and fast. She caught occasional words, a name she didn't know, the word for hotel, a number that might have been an address. She didn't ask for translation. She concentrated on the road and listened to the tone of his voice, the quality of the exchanges, who he was speaking to with what register of authority, what the pauses meant, where the silences were and how long they ran. He made 4 calls between the alley and the bridge. The first 2 were instructions. The third was a negotiation. She could hear it in the extended back and forth, the specific flatness he maintained against what sounded like resistance, until the resistance resolved. The fourth was different, shorter. The voice on the other end was older. She could hear it even through the phone's compression. And Min-jae's voice, when he responded, had a quality it hadn't had in the other 3 calls, something fractionally more careful. The difference between how you speak to someone you control and how you speak to someone whose cooperation you require. He hung up. "The third judge," she said. He looked at her. "You could hear that. I could hear that you needed something and weren't certain you'd get it." A pause. "He's agreed to make the location available." An event space in Mapo that's registered under a cultural foundation he has no visible connection to. Neutral enough that the other organizations will accept it. And Junho? His second has been contacted. The summit invitation goes through formal channels, the established protocol for territorial disputes. He can't refuse without signaling weakness to the neutral parties. But he knows it's not actually about territory. He knows, but protocol is protocol. It provides a structure that everyone inside this world uses to avoid situations that would otherwise require immediate violence. Min-jae looked out at the river, the Mapo Bridge's white lights reflected in long, broken lines on the water below. Tonight, those protocols are the only thing standing between a negotiation and a war. And if he doesn't want a negotiation, then I need to make him want one. How? Min-jae was quiet for a moment. By giving him something he wants more than he wants to destroy me. She crossed the bridge, tires loud on the expansion joints, the river enormous and black and indifferent below. On the north side of the Han, Seoul was different. Older money, older architecture, quieter street life at this hour. Left at the second intersection, Min-jae said. She turned. A narrower street, residential, the buildings lower here. She could feel the neighborhood change through the car in the way you feel terrain change. Sound absorption, light quality, the specific density of a built environment. Right. She turned again. An underground parking structure entrance ahead, its shutter rolled up, interior lit with the orange-white of sodium lamps. She pulled in. 2 cars already in the space, both dark, both running. She could see the exhaust in the cold air. Men standing near them. 5, 6. The specific quality of posture she had learned to read tonight, operational readiness without visible weapons, which didn't mean without weapons. She stopped the car, cut the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. When we go in, Min-jae said, you're not visible. You stay to the perimeter. You watch. And if something happens to you, then you leave through the vehicle entrance and you don't stop. That's not Arielle. He turned to look at her fully, and his face in the sodium light was tired and precise and more present than she had seen it yet, all the layers compressed by the late hour and the accumulated damage of the evening into something simple and direct. If something happens to me, the only thing that matters is that you're not in the room. Do you understand? She looked at him. She thought about the wallboard in the office, the 15 years of careful construction. She thought about 13 people and a boy of 17, and a man who had spent every year since building a life predicated on the premise that attachment was the failure mode. She thought about a black handkerchief pressed into her hand in a locked room. I understand, she said. She didn't agree, but she understood. They got out of the car. The event space was 3 blocks from the parking structure, accessible through a service entrance that one of Min-jae's men had already opened. An old building, concrete frame, late 1970s, the kind of construction that outlasted its era through sheer material stubbornness. The interior had been renovated into a blank-walled event space at some point. High ceilings, polished concrete floors, adjustable lighting currently set at low ambient. The kind of space that could be a gallery or a conference venue or, at 2:30 in the morning with 6 men arranged around its perimeter, a place where 2 criminal organizations sat across from each other and determined what the next phase of their relationship would look like. Min-jae's men had arranged the space simply. A table at the center, 4 chairs on each side, a bottle of water on each side, no glasses. Nothing on the table that could be lifted and used. She positioned herself near the far wall, in the shadow left by a structural column. Min-jae didn't look at her as he walked to the table. He sat in the center chair on his side, his back to the entrance, which she understood was deliberate, a demonstration that he had sufficient control of the space to afford not watching the door. They waited. 8 minutes. Then the entrance opened. Seo Junho was younger than she'd expected. The name had carried a weight in conversation that she'd unconsciously translated into physical years, and the reality of him, 29, maybe 30, lean in the specific way of someone whose body processed stress through metabolism, dark jacket, over a gray shirt, no tie, arrived with the cognitive dissonance of a face that didn't yet match the damage it had caused. But the eyes were older than the face. She noticed that immediately. the eyes of someone who had been watching a specific thing for a long time and had organized their entire interior life around the watching. He came in with 3 men and sat directly across from Min Jae. For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other, and she held her breath in the shadow of the column and watched both faces and tried to read the language being spoken in the space between them. The accumulated history of 2 organizations and 1 inheritance and 15 years of territorial negotiation and counterpressure compressed into the specific quality of 2 men looking at each other across a table at 2 in the morning. Junho spoke first. Korean. She couldn't follow the full content, but she caught the cadence, formal, opening protocol, the established language of territorial dispute. Min Jae responded in kind, same register, same formality, the ritual acknowledgement of the summit's official pretense. Then Junho switched to English. I want to acknowledge, he said, that this conversation is overdue. His English was better than she'd expected, careful and precise, the kind of precision that came from studying rather than immersion, with an accent she couldn't immediately locate. We agree on that, Min Jae said. The Incheon border question has been... We're not here about Incheon, Min Jae said. A pause. Junho's eyes moved fractionally, a micro-shift, the kind that meant recalibration. He'd expected Min Jae to hold the official pretense longer. The early departure from it unsettled him slightly, which was what Min Jae had intended. No, Junho said after a moment. We're not. Then say what you came to say. Junho leaned back in his chair with the studied casualness of someone who had rehearsed this posture. His hands on the table were still. Your organization has contained mine for 6 years. Banking exclusions, political interference, selective enforcement through channels I don't need to specify. 6 years of growth deliberately suppressed. He paused. My father accepted those terms. I don't. Your father was practical, Min Jae said. My father is dead. A beat. Yes, I know. Something moved through Junho's face at that, fast, briefly uncontrolled, and she catalogued it immediately. Grief rerouted into anger over a long enough period that the two had become structurally indistinguishable. The anger was real, but the driver underneath it was something more complicated, something that had been shaped by watching a specific person in a specific way for a specific number of years. He wasn't just here about territory. She had known that already from what Min Jae had said, but seeing it on his face made it specific. Junho had grown up watching his father's organization get contained by one man, had organized his identity around that watching. And now the man responsible was sitting 4 feet away, and he had, for the first time, what he believed was leverage over him. What do you want? Min Jae said. Seoul, Junho said simply. Not all of it. The Yeouido corridor, banking district access, removal of the existing obstacles. And the alternative? Junho's eyes moved, not to Min Jae, across the room, in the specific direction of the structural column she was standing behind. The movement was fast and could have been coincidence. It wasn't. He knew she was there. Her stomach tightened. The alternative, Junho said, returning his gaze to Min Jae, is that certain information reaches certain people. Judges, a deputy minister, documentation, a slight emphasis on the word, of arrangements that would be professionally inconvenient. You said you had documentation, Min Jae said very carefully. I have enough. She heard the tell. Min Jae heard it too. She knew because of the fractional shift in his posture, the smallest compression of the space between his shoulder blades. Junho had names. He might have supplementary material, partial records, witness accounts, but the specific documentation of the arrangements, the kind that would survive legal scrutiny, he didn't have. Park had said names only. Yun, she suspected, had provided organizational charts and banking routes, not the underlying instruments. Junho was bluffing on the documentation. He was not bluffing on everything else. Min Jae said, I'll consider the Yeouido question. Junho smiled. It was the smile of someone who had been sitting with the anticipation of something for years and was now watching it begin to materialize. I was hoping you'd say that. On conditions. Of course. Park and Hyun are returned to me. Min Jae's voice didn't change. Whatever arrangement you have with them is over. Junho's smile stayed, but the quality of it changed. You found Park. Tonight. And Hyun. A small pause. You're faster than my timeline accounted for. Your timeline was built on a misunderstanding, Min Jae said, about what I was managing and what I was choosing not to. This visibly caught Junho. She could see it in the slight forward adjustment of his posture, the way he was recalibrating. He had come in believing he had a picture of Min Jae's vulnerabilities. The suggestion that some of those vulnerabilities had been visible and permitted rather than invisible and exploited introduced a variable he hadn't planned for. The other condition, Min Jae continued, is that this arrangement is documented, formally, through the neutral parties. He gestured to the room around him, the implicit acknowledgement of the judicial connection behind the location. You operate in the Yeouido corridor under terms we both sign, not a verbal agreement, not an understanding, a document. Junho studied him. That exposes both of us equally. Yes. You're comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with symmetry, Min Jae said. I don't make arrangements that only bind one side. She watched Junho run this through whatever internal calculus he'd arrived with. The documentation request was unexpected. It signaled that Min Jae was not negotiating from fear, was not simply trying to survive the evening, was thinking about the shape of a long-term arrangement. That was not the response of a man who had been destabilized. She watched Junho recalibrate. And she watched, in the recalibration, the thing she'd been looking for since he sat down. The seam. The place where the performance of this controlled, strategic young man had a gap in it. Not tactical, personal. He was looking at Min Jae with something underneath the calculation that he didn't know was visible. She could see it because she had spent 2 years learning to read the specific expression of a person who has organized their life around something absent, around a lack, and who does not know that the lack shows. Junho had hated Min Jae for a long time. Specifically, personally, the hatred of someone who needed an answer to a question that the other person embodied. How do you survive losing everything and build something anyway? His father had not survived the containment, not professionally. She didn't know the details, but the grief in Junho's eyes was the grief of someone who had watched a specific long decline, not a sudden loss. She pushed off from the wall. Min Jae saw her move, a fractional tension in his shoulders. Not panic, warning, the physical equivalent of wait. She walked to the table anyway. Junho looked at her. His men looked at her. One of them shifted weight toward her and stopped when Min Jae raised one hand slightly from the table surface, the smallest possible gesture. She stood at the end of the table, not Min Jae's side, the middle, the space between. He didn't make your father decline, she said to Junho. The room went very still. Junho looked at her with the expression of someone who had not been spoken to by an unexpected variable and was working out how to categorize the intrusion. Excuse me, he said. Your father's organization contracted when Min Jae's expanded. That's not the same thing as Min Jae destroying it. Her voice was even. She wasn't performing calm. She was genuinely in the architectural space she went to when she was reading something structural, the cold, focused place where emotion ran underneath rather than through. And you know that. But knowing it doesn't change what you feel about it. Bi Junho's eyes moved to Min Jae. A fast, hard look. Min Jae said nothing. The documentation he's offering you, she continued, is worth more than you came in here planning to take. It binds him, yes. It also legitimizes you. In writing. Through channels that the other organizations respect. You stop being the son trying to reclaim his father's territory, and you become a party to a formal arrangement with the most established organization in the city. She paused. Your father never had that. Junho was very still. You came here to prove something, she said. About whether you could reach what he cares about. Whether you could make him human. She looked at him steadily. You already proved it. Downstairs at Club Obsidian 2 hours ago. Every person in that room saw what happened when you put a target on me. You got what you came for. Another pause. The question is whether that's enough, or whether you need to burn everything down just to make sure the point lands. The silence afterward was the specific silence of a room where something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone present is deciding what to do with it. Junho looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face. Not softness. She wouldn't characterize it as softness. More like the specific release that comes when a pressure that has been building in one direction for years is finally acknowledged from outside, when someone names the thing rather than dancing around it. And the naming does something to the internal architecture that no amount of tactical maneuvering could accomplish. Then one of Junho's men spoke. Korean, sharp, low. She caught two words, pale crane, and a third she didn't know. Junho's face changed. He looked at the man. A short exchange. Then he looked back at the table, and what was on his face now was different, harder, faster, the strategic layer reasserting itself over whatever she had briefly opened. "There's a complication," he said. Min-jae straightened fractionally. "What complication?" "I came here with 3 conditions for this meeting." Junho's voice had flattened. "The Yeouido corridor, the political obstacles removed, and a third." He paused. "The third condition doesn't come from me." The air in the room shifted. "Someone else has an interest in tonight's outcome," Junho continued. "Someone who provided resources to my organization over the past 18 months in anticipation of this negotiation, someone who has their own terms." "Who?" Min-jae said. Junho looked at him. "You know who." Min-jae was quiet for 3 seconds that felt like considerably longer. Then he said, "Lee Byung-chul." She didn't know the name, but she knew from the specific quality of silence that followed it, from the way Min-jae's hands, previously loose on the table, pressed flat against the surface, that whatever she'd understood about the stakes of tonight had just been revised upward. "He's been funding you," Min-jae said. Not a question. "Advising," Junho said carefully. "Resources. Strategic. He's been using you," Min-jae said, "to get to me, because he can't get to me directly." The flatness in his voice was extreme now, so compressed it had the quality of something under enormous pressure. "He's been using your father's name and your grief and 6 years of your life to build a position that serves him, not you." Junho's jaw tightened. "That's... Lee Byung-chul was my partner," Min-jae said. 15 years ago. He is the person who sold information that killed 13 people. He is the person I removed from this organization." A pause, each word precisely placed. "He is not dead. I should have made him dead. I chose instead to let him leave the city, and that decision was a mistake I have been living with, and tonight it has arrived to collect." The room was absolutely silent. Junho was looking at Min-jae with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, processing the information, running it against whatever he'd been told, measuring the gap between the two, and underneath all of it, the specific expression of someone whose leverage has just shifted in ways he needs time to calculate. "He told me Junho started. "I know what he told you." Min-jae's voice was not loud. It was worse than loud. "He told you enough truth to make the rest believable. That's how he works. It's always how he worked." He looked at Junho steadily. "He is using this summit. Whatever his third condition is, it's not for your benefit. It never was." A long moment. Junho's second leaned in and spoke in his ear. Junho listened. His face went through something complex and brief and then arrived at a decision. She watched the decision land. "He's outside," Junho said. The words hit the room like a change in air pressure. "Lee Byung-chul," Junho said. "He came to Seoul tonight. He's been outside this building for the past 20 minutes, waiting for a signal from me that the terms were agreed." Another pause. "He wants to come in." Min-jae looked at Junho for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Just once. Fast. The look contained several things she'd learned to read in the space of one night. A question, a warning, and something underneath both of those. Something that was neither operational nor strategic, but was simply the look of a man who was about to do something that could not be undone, and who wanted to know that the person across the room understood the full weight of it. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. He looked away. Back to Junho. "Let him in, Min-jae Let him in," Min-jae said. The entrance door opened. Cold air moved through the space, the night coming in from outside, the distant sound of the river, and the rain-soaked city. Lee Byung-chul walked into the room. He was older than Min-jae by perhaps 10 years, heavier. The specific heaviness of a man who had spent 15 years in a kind of stasis, eating and drinking and existing but not building, waiting for the momentum that would allow him to move again. His face had the quality she had seen on certain people who had done serious damage and lived comfortably inside the memory of it. Not haunted, settled. The way you settle into something that defines you. He looked at Min-jae. Min-jae looked at him. 15 years in the space between them. 13 people. A boy of 17. An organization rebuilt from ruin. And on the other side of it, a man who had watched that rebuilding from a distance and had spent the years since positioning himself for this room, this moment, this table. Min-jae, Byung-chul said. His voice was warm. Genuinely warm, in the way of someone who feels warmth toward things they have damaged and intend to damage further. You look tired. Min-jae said nothing. I've been waiting a long time for this conversation, Byung-chul said. He pulled out a chair, not Junho's side, the middle, the third position, and sat down with the ease of someone making themselves at home in a room they consider already theirs. But I think we're past the point where the old grievances serve either of us. He looked around the table. I have a proposal, one that benefits everyone here, including his eyes moved to Arielle. Your new variable. She felt the look land, felt the specific quality of it, not threatening, appraising. The way you look at something you intend to find useful. The proposal, Byung-chul continued, is simple. The Black Lotus Syndicate restructures. Junho takes the Yeouido corridor as agreed. I take operational oversight of the Gangnam banking routes. Min-jae retains nominal leadership for the political relationships that still require his name. He smiled. A partnership, like we once had. You're not a partner, Min-jae said. You're a man who bought a young man's grief and pointed it at me like a weapon. Byung-chul's warmth didn't flicker. That's one way to see it. What do you actually have? Min-jae said. Not what Junho told me you have. What do you have that you're willing to use tonight? A pause. Byung-chul reached into his jacket and removed a small drive. Flat, black, the size of a thumb. He set it on the table between them. Everything Hyun collected, he said, in a format suitable for submission to 3 separate investigative bodies. Organized, indexed, and with corroborating material I've been assembling for 4 years. He looked at the drive on the table. Not names, instruments. The actual documentation of every arrangement, clean, complete, and already transmitted to a holding address that releases automatically in, he checked his watch, 72 hours, unless I cancel the release personally. The room processed this. She processed it. Not a bluff. The specific confidence of someone describing something real, the texture of the details, the timeline with its built-in leverage, the casual gesture of setting the drive on the table rather than holding it. The proposal, Byung-chul said again, quietly. Or the alternative. Your choice, Min-jae. You have... Another glance at his watch. I'd say about 30 seconds before the men I have outside this building stop waiting politely. And that was when the lights went out. Not a power failure, she knew the difference. This was deliberate, the specific darkness of a building whose electrical supply had been cut at the source, total and immediate, every sodium lamp and emergency strip simultaneous, leaving nothing but the ambient glow of Seoul bleeding through the high windows in long gray strips. In the gray light she saw Min-jae move, fast. Not toward Byung-chul, laterally, out of his chair, the movement of someone who had anticipated the darkness and planned for it, whose body had already decided while his voice was still speaking. She heard the door burst open, not the entrance they'd come through. The service door on the east wall. Multiple sets of footsteps on the concrete, the specific sound of people moving with purpose in darkness, and somewhere in the noise of it, a voice, Byung-chul's, flat now, the warmth stripped away, saying something in Korean that she understood without translation as an instruction to take her. A hand closed on her arm. She drove her elbow back the same way she had in the penthouse. Same compact motion, same targeted pressure. And this time she felt the impact properly, the grunt of someone who hadn't expected it, and she was already moving, away from the hand and toward the strip of gray window light that gave her the room's orientation. She heard Min-jae's voice in the dark. Not a word. Her name. Short, directional, telling her where he was. She moved toward it. The room had become a set of sounds and shapes. Bodies moving, impacts, the specific percussion of a confined space where multiple people were fighting in the dark. And underneath it, Jun-ho's voice saying something sharp and repeated that sounded like a command being issued and not obeyed. She reached Min-jae by feel, her hand finding the fabric of his jacket in the gray dark. And he pulled her behind him with one hand while the other came up to meet someone she couldn't see. And what followed was not the choreographed violence of someone performing capability, but the raw, compressed violence of someone fighting in a small space without visibility, each movement chosen for efficiency and nothing else. She heard Byung-chul near the table, still, waiting. The sound of a man who had others to do the physical work and knew it, who was listening to the room the way you listen to something you believe you control. The emergency lights came on. Red, dim, the building's backup system kicking in 45 seconds after the cut, casting the space in the flat crimson of a darkroom. In the red light, she could see the room properly for the first time since the blackout. Min-jae and two of Byung-chul's men, one on the floor, one still standing. Jun-ho and his three men near the far wall, not participating, she registered, standing back with the specific quality of people who were reassessing whether this was still their fight. Min-jae's men from the perimeter, three of them, moving through from the service entrance, and Byung-chul at the table. The drive still on the table in front of him, his hand on it, his eyes on Min-jae. 30 seconds, he said in the red light, calm, warm again. Think carefully, Min-jae. Think about what you're protecting. Think about whether it's worth. It's a copy, Arielle said. Both men looked at her. She was standing 6 feet from the table, in the red light, with the specific focus of someone who had been reading documents for a living for 2 years and had looked at the drive on the table and thought about the confidence with which it had been placed there, and the leverage of a 72-hour release, and the structural logic of a man who had spent 4 years assembling something he intended to use once and completely. The drive, she said. Whatever's on it is already transmitted. You said that. The release is automatic unless you cancel it personally. She looked at Byung-chul, which means the drive is either a copy or it's empty. The actual material is somewhere else. The drive is theater. It's for Min-jae to try to take it, so he looks like he's fighting for something you already have him on. The room was very still. Byung-chul looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not the warm smile. Something realer than that. Something that acknowledged, without pleasure, that the variable he had dismissed had just demonstrated its value in the wrong direction. Smarter than I expected, he said. Cancel the release, Min-jae said. Now. Why would I? Because Jun-ho is standing against that wall trying to decide whose side he's on, Min-jae said. And the answer to that question determines the next 10 years of his organization's existence. And right now what he's seeing is you, in this room, with men who are not following his instructions, running an operation he wasn't fully briefed on, using resources he provided for your purposes rather than his. He paused. How long before he does the math on that? Jun-ho had gone very still against the far wall. Byung-chul turned toward him. A fraction of a second, fast, controlled, but she'd seen it. The look of a man checking on a piece of his plan and finding it less stable than expected. That fraction of a second was all Min-jae needed. He crossed the table in 2 steps, and his hand closed on Byung-chul's wrist, the one with the phone he'd been reaching for in the split second of his attention elsewhere. And the grip was not the grip of anger, was not Damien's grip in the bar, was not performance or cruelty, but the absolute economy of someone who knew exactly how much force a specific physical goal required and applied only that amount. And Byung-chul went rigid, and the phone clattered to the concrete floor, and in the red emergency light of a room that had been, 40 minutes ago, a blank and neutral space and was now something else entirely. The 2 men looked at each other across a distance of 18 inches and 15 years. The phone was on the floor, Byung-chul's wrist was in Min-jae's grip, and the red emergency light made everything look like something had already bled. And in the 18 inches between the two men was 15 years of accumulated damage that had never been properly accounted for and was now, finally, in a room with nowhere left to defer to. Byung-chul didn't struggle. That was the thing she registered immediately. He didn't pull against the grip, didn't try to free himself. He looked at Min-jae with the expression of a man who had known this moment was the destination and had walked toward it anyway. And what was in the looking was not fear and not defiance, but something older than either. "You should have killed me," Byung-chul said. 15 years ago. "Yes," Min-jae said. "Why didn't you?" A pause. The room held still around that question. Jun-ho against the wall, the remaining men in their positions, Arielle standing in the red half-dark. Waiting. "Because killing you would have made what you did the defining fact of everything that came after," Min-jae said. "I didn't want to give you that." Byung-chul absorbed this. Something moved across his face. Not the warmth, not the performance, something that lived underneath both of those and had been living there for 15 years without much air. "And now," Byung-chul said, "now I need the cancellation code for the release." "And if I don't give it?" "Then I give Jun-ho the documentation I have on your arrangement with the Incheon Port Authority," Min-jae said. "The one you've been running under the Pale Crane's name for the past 3 years while taking 60% of the yield. The arrangement that Jun-ho's organization has been providing cover for without knowing it was cover." He paused. "How long do you think that conversation takes?" Byung-chul's eyes moved to Jun-ho. Jun-ho was already looking at him, not with the expression of someone receiving new information, with the expression of someone watching a suspicion they'd been suppressing get confirmed in real time. The specific look of a young man who had given years of his life and his father's name to something that had been extracting from him the entire time. The silence stretched. Then Byung-chul made a sound that was almost a laugh, short, through the nose. The sound of a man acknowledging a loss, not with grace, but with the exhausted honesty of someone who has run out of moves and knows it. "Let go of my wrist," he said. Min-jae released him. Byung-chul reached into his jacket, slowly, the specific slowness of someone demonstrating that the movement is not a threat, that the performance is over, and removed a second phone, older, basic keypad. He pressed a sequence of numbers and held it to his ear. 30 seconds. A voice on the other end. He said 6 words in Korean, hung up, and set the phone on the table next to the drive. "It's canceled," he said. "I'll verify that," Min-jae said. "I know." Byung-chul straightened his jacket. In the red light, his face looked its full age, all the years in it, every decision. "You always verify." Min-jae nodded to the man nearest the east entrance. The man took Byung-chul by the arm, not violently, with the professional firmness of someone performing a custodial function, and walked him toward the service door. Byung-chul went without resistance. He didn't look at Min-jae again. He looked at the floor, then at the door ahead of him, and then he was through it and gone. And the sound of the door closing behind him was not dramatic, was just a door closing. The ordinary mechanical sound of a thing ending. The emergency lights hummed. The room breathed. Jun-ho pushed off from the wall. He walked to the center of the space, stopped across the table from Min-jae, and stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets. Not aggressive, not deferential. The posture of someone recalibrating in real time and choosing to let the recalibration be visible. "The documentation on the port arrangement," Jun-ho said. "How long have you had it?" 14 months. "And you didn't use it." "I don't use things until I need them," Min-jae said. "That's the difference between a weapon and leverage." Jun-ho looked at him. Something moved in his face. The same seam she'd seen earlier, the grief-shaped space underneath everything else. But different now. Not driven. Not pointed. Just present. The way grief eventually settles when the forward momentum that's been sustaining it runs out and what remains is the original shape of the loss. "My father," Jun-ho said. "Did he know?" "About Byung-chul." Min-jae was quiet for a moment. "He knew enough to keep his distance, but not enough to warn me. He died before Byung-chul approached you. I think Another pause, careful. I think he would have. This landed in Junho slowly. She watched it land. The reorientation that required, the particular grief of learning that a protection you never received had nonetheless been intended. He nodded once. The nod of someone filing something in a place they'd need to return to later, privately, when there was room for it. The Yoido corridor, Junho said. The offer still stands? With documentation, Min-jae said. Through the third judge, terms that bind both sides. Symmetry, Junho said. Yes. A long moment. All right, Junho said. They didn't shake hands. She noticed that, the deliberate absence of the gesture, both of them understanding that what had happened in this room was too recent and too complicated for the performance of resolution. What they had was not trust. It was a specific practical acknowledgement that the alternative was worse for both of them, and that this was sometimes enough to build on, and that the building would take time. Junho gathered his men and walked out through the main entrance into the Seoul night. The room was empty, except for the two of them, and the remaining men at the perimeter, and the red emergency light still cycling, and the drive on the table and the basic phone beside it, and the concrete floor and the high windows showing the city outside still burning, still wet, still going. Min-jae stood at the table. She watched him stand there and didn't speak, because she understood from the quality of his stillness that he needed a moment that wasn't operational, wasn't strategic. That was simply the moment after something that had been waiting for 15 years finally finished arriving. He picked up the drive, looked at it. Then he set it in his jacket pocket and turned. He looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her at the window in the penthouse, the brief, unguarded look before everything came apart. This was something different, more worn, more specific, the look of a man who has been through a thing and come out the other side and is now standing in the particular light of that aftermath, trying to understand what he is standing in. You're bleeding, she said. He looked down. His left hand, the scarred hand, had a cut across the knuckle, the same knuckle the old scar ran through, fresh blood running dark in the red light. He looked at it with something that was almost wry. Almost. Again, he said. She crossed to him. He didn't move away. She took the black handkerchief, still in the pocket of the borrowed trousers she was wearing, she'd kept it without deciding to, and pressed it against his hand, and he let her, and they stood there in the red light of an empty event space in Mapo. At 3 a.m, with the city outside and the aftermath inside, and the specific exhausted quiet of two people who had come through something together and were still alive and still standing and weren't sure yet what to do with that. The drive on the table, the phone, the marks on the concrete floor where men had fallen, all of it evidence of something that would need to be processed and cleared and managed in the hours and days ahead. But not this second. This second was just the handkerchief in his hand and the sound of the city coming through the high windows and her own heartbeat slowly finding its way back to a pace she recognized. The main power came back on at 3:17. The sodium lights returned and the red washed out and the room became ordinary again. Concrete and high ceilings and the neutral palette of a space that had held what it needed to hold tonight and was now just a room. She stepped back. He flexed his hand experimentally, checking the cut, the way you check something to understand its functional implication rather than its pain. Byung-chul, she said, what happens to him? There are organizations in Busan he has outstanding obligations with, Min-jae said. I'll ensure they're aware of his current location. He paused. It's not a death sentence. But close. He made his choices 15 years ago. The consequences have been accruing interest. She nodded. She didn't have a more compassionate position than that. She'd met the man for 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes had felt the specific quality of someone who operated without remainder, who did not carry what they'd done as weight but as asset, who had looked at her across the table and categorized her as a variable before she'd finished standing up. Some people were simply what they had decided to be, and the deciding had been finished long ago. They drove back across the city as it was beginning the particular slow shift from night to not yet morning, that specific hour before first light when Seoul ran on minimum staff and maximum quiet, the delivery scooters out but the taxis sparse, the river dark and flat under low cloud. She drove. He sat in the passenger seat with his injured hand resting on his knee and his head slightly back against the headrest, and his eyes mostly closed, not sleeping, the eyes closed posture of someone who is very tired and is allowing their body a partial recovery. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned in 2 years of translation work that silence was not a problem requiring solution. Silence was often the most accurate response to what had actually been said. The instinct to fill it was social reflex, not genuine communication, and she had gradually trained herself out of the worst of it. They crossed the Han again going east, and the bridge lights made moving patterns on the hood of the car, and she thought about the outline of the night and tried to map it the way she mapped buildings. Load-bearing elements, stress points, the unexpected voids where structure was assumed but absent. Damien Cross felt very far away. She checked herself for the feeling she would have expected, the specific rawness of a wound recently pressed on, and found instead something flatter. Not numbness. Resolution, maybe. The whiskey-in-the-face moment had been real, and had hurt, and had been witnessed, and had been answered in a room full of people, and whatever debt of humiliation had accumulated across 2 years of a relationship that had been diminishing her by gradual degrees had been paid tonight in a currency she hadn't requested, but had nonetheless received. She thought about Damien's face when the investors left, when the girlfriend walked out without looking back. She didn't feel satisfaction at the memory. She felt something quieter than satisfaction, a specific loosening in the chest, like a hand she hadn't known was there releasing its grip. The accounts, she said, the Busan account, the Mapo arrangement. I'll have documentation to a lawyer by end of the week, Min-jae said, without opening his eyes. The specific instruments. Enough to dispute the debt. That could take years in court. It won't go to court. The notary in Mapo is still practicing. He has significantly more to lose than you do. She understood the implication. You're going to speak to him. I'm going to ensure he's aware of the legal exposure he's currently carrying. A pause. And that there's a clean resolution available if he cooperates. She drove for a moment in silence. You had all of this ready. I had the components available. Since when? A longer pause this time. Since it became clear what Damien Cross had been doing inside my territory, which was approximately 3 months ago. She processed this. 3 months. While she'd been translating contracts in her apartment and bartending private events, and not quite letting herself name the full shape of what had been done to her financially, someone had been assembling the documentation. Not for her. Not deliberately for her. She understood that, didn't dress it up into something it wasn't. But the information existed, and tonight it had been brought to bear. And the difference between the debt she'd woken up with yesterday morning and the debt she would face next week was the difference between drowning and standing on ground that was at least technically solid. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't sure it was the right word for something this complicated. I want to understand something, she said. He opened his eyes, turned his head slightly toward her. The organizational map, she said. The wallboard. If Hyun transmitted it to Byung-chul, I'll rebuild it, Min-jae said. How long did the original take? 7 years? And you'll just rebuild it. The elements that were compromised need to be rebuilt regardless. The elements that weren't, he stopped. I know the structure. It's in my head. The board was a working document, not the primary record. She glanced at him briefly. He was looking at the road ahead, the city coming toward them through the wet windshield. You're not as damaged as he thought you'd be, she said. After tonight. Byung-chul built his strategy around a version of me from 15 years ago, Min-jae said. A version that survived by becoming entirely closed. He expected to find that version. A pause. He found something different. She thought about this. Because of tonight. Because of what happened at the club. Because of what happened before tonight, too. The version of me he planned for hadn't changed. I had been changing for longer than I was aware. He was quiet for a moment. Slowly. The way he said slowly had a quality she understood, the specific acknowledgement of a process that had been occurring below conscious attention, the kind of change that you only recognize in retrospect, when you look back and find that the person who made an earlier decision and the person making a current decision are not quite the same person, and you can't identify the specific moment of difference. She thought about her own version of that. The specific morning, 8 months ago, when she had woken up and understood without ceremony or drama that she was not going back to Damien Cross. Not because she had decided it as an act of will, but because something had simply finished, the way a body eventually finishes fighting an infection, and she had gotten up and made coffee and gone to work, and that had been the end of it. The decision had happened without her. She had just caught up. She pulled off the main road into the Mapo neighborhood, following the route back toward the building from memory now, the street pattern having arranged itself in her head the way routes did when you drove them with attention. "Park," she said. Min-jae was quiet. 7 years, she said. "And he sat across from you tonight, and he looked," she tried to find the right word, "tired. Not guilty. Tired." "Park had a sister," Min-jae said. 3 years ago, she was diagnosed with something expensive. The treatment was available in Germany. Junho offered to cover the cost. A pause that had weight in it. "She's been in remission for 18 months. She absorbed this. He didn't do it for himself," she said. "No. What will you do with him?" A long silence, the longest of the drive. "I don't know yet," Min-jae said, and the honesty of that. The uncharacteristic admission of an unmade decision from a man whose currency was precisely made decisions told her that the question was genuinely open in a way that not many questions were for him. That Park existed in a category he was still constructing the walls of, where the crime and the reason for it and the 7 years that preceded it all lived together in a space that didn't have a clean resolution. "His sister's treatment," she said. "Is it still—" "It continues," Min-jae said quietly. "The arrangement doesn't change." She didn't respond to that. She let it sit where it was, not commented on, not elevated into something it would resist being elevated into. It was a decision made in the dark, privately, by a man who had been betrayed and had chosen not to allow the betrayal to cost someone who had nothing to do with it. It was not redemption. It was not forgiveness. It was something more specific than either. A single choice, contained and clean. She parked in the alley behind the building. They sat for a moment. The engine ticked. The rain had stopped somewhere in the past hour, and the alley was wet and still, the overhead lamp making a yellow circle on the slick asphalt. "What happens tomorrow?" she said. "The judge will need to be briefed. The documentation for Junho's arrangement needs to be drafted. The banking routes need to be audited for what Hyun compromised." He shifted in the seat, facing forward, cataloging. "Byung-chul's contacts in Busan need to be notified. Park needs to be—" He stopped. "Dealt with. In some fashion." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. She looked back. "I meant what happens tomorrow. With this." He understood. She could see him understand. The specific difficulty on his face was not the difficulty of a man who didn't know what he felt. It was the difficulty of a man who did know, who had known since the moment in the club when he'd stood up without fully deciding to, and who was currently navigating the specific terrain of someone who has spent 15 years building infrastructure around the premise that this particular kind of knowing was inadmissible and is now standing at the edge of admitting it with all the physical caution of a person testing ice. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I've been—" He paused, choosing the word. "Closed. For a long time. The way I operate, the way I think about proximity, about what I allow. Tonight was not—" Another pause. "I didn't plan tonight. I know that too. I'm telling you because you should understand what you're—" He stopped again, and this time the stop had a different quality. The stop of a man who has started a sentence with a particular ending in mind and has reached the end and found it insufficient. "I'm not a simple thing to be near," he said finally. Tonight demonstrated that. She looked at him for a moment. "I've been near Damien Cross for 2 years," she said. "I know the difference between complicated and cruel." He was quiet. "You're complicated," she said. "That's not the same thing." The alley was very still around them. He reached across and touched the side of her face. Not the cut side, the other side. Just his palm against her jaw for a moment, the same way he'd held her at the window before the phone had rung and everything had fractured into the night's emergency. and she turned into it slightly the way you turn toward warmth, the body's honest response without the mind's editing. And they stayed like that for a moment in the parked car in the wet alley, with Seoul going on around them in its indifferent midnight way. Then his phone buzzed. The regular one. He exhaled through his nose, the sound of a man who has learned to accept interruption as structural. She almost laughed. She didn't, quite. Go, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. I'll have a car take you. I'll take this one, she said. I know the route. He nodded. He got out of the car. He was already reading the phone screen, already moving back into the operational register, and she watched him walk to the building's service entrance and enter without looking back. Not because he didn't want to look back, she thought, but because looking back was a habit he was still learning to rebuild. She sat for a moment in the driver's seat. Then she pulled out of the alley and drove home. Her apartment was the same as she'd left it. This was always faintly surprising after nights that felt like they should have changed the furniture, rearranged the physics of familiar rooms. The translation work on the desk, the coffee cup she'd rinsed and left to dry, the window facing the courtyard with its single struggling tree that she'd watched through 2 Korean winters. She sat at the desk without turning on the lamp. She looked at the translation work, a contract for a tech firm's Seoul subsidiary, routine corporate language, the kind of document that made up the solid, unspectacular majority of her work. She'd been doing this for 2 years. She was good at it. The pay was functional and occasionally better than functional, and the work asked nothing of her except precision, which she had in adequate supply. She thought about architecture school, not with the specific ache she'd grown accustomed to attaching to the memory, the ache of something abandoned, something given up under pressure, but with a different quality. She thought about what she had actually been good at, the structural reading, the load-bearing analysis, the instinct for looking at a space and understanding what was holding it up and what was decorative and what was concealed within the walls. She had used that tonight, not in a building. She looked at the window. The tree in the courtyard was bare, still winter, still waiting. The sky above the courtyard was the specific gray of Seoul before dawn, not dark and not light. The city in its brief, uncertain pause between what it had been all night and what it was about to become. She opened her laptop. Not the translation work, a different window. An architecture program she hadn't opened in 11 months, hadn't been able to open without the specific grief-adjacent feeling that came with things you had set aside under pressure and hadn't been able to return to. She opened it now. She didn't draw anything. She just looked at the blank workspace for a while. The grid, the tools along the side, the empty white field waiting for something to be placed in it. Then she started drawing. Nothing specific at first. Foundation lines, the basic geometry of structure. She had always started with foundation. Her professor in Chicago had said she was one of the few students who instinctively began with what was underground rather than what was visible, who understood that the part you didn't see was the part that everything else depended on. She drew until the light changed in the courtyard window, until the gray became something with color in it, until the city outside reassembled itself into morning. She thought about a wallboard covered in colored threads, 15 years of organizational structure rendered in a single person's hand, the kind of document that only exists because the person who made it trusted nothing, they couldn't verify themselves. She thought about rebuilding, not her version of it or his version of it, just the fact of it, that it was possible, that the doing of it was slow and specific and didn't resolve into a clean moment, but accumulated in the way all real construction accumulated, material by material, day by day, the thing becoming visible only gradually and from the right angle, and only to someone who had been watching closely enough to see the change. The morning came fully. She closed the laptop. She made coffee. Not the expensive kind, the functional kind, the kind that tasted like what it was, and stood at the window with the cup and watched the courtyard tree in the early light. Still bare. Still there. The kind of thing that had survived multiple seasons by being exactly what it was, without adjustment or apology, deeply rooted in ordinary ground. 3 weeks later, the lawyer Min Jae had referenced called her. A woman, Korean, precise and efficient in the specific way of people who had been working in complicated environments for a long time and had processed the complication into professional fluency. She laid out the situation in clear language. The notary and Mapo had signed a corrected declaration, the Busan account had been disputed through the appropriate financial authority, and the debt that had been accumulating under Arielle's name for 14 months was, pending a 6-week administrative process, no longer hers. She sat at the translation desk after the call and looked at the wall for a while. Then she called the architecture firm she'd been in correspondence with before Damien, the one in the Hongdae district that did restoration work, that had sent her an interview request 2 years ago that she'd never followed up on because she'd been in the process of convincing herself that her previous life's ambitions were no longer available to her. They remembered her. She did not try to explain the gap. She said she was interested in restoration work and had a portfolio she could send, and the woman on the phone said she should come in, and she said she would. Club Obsidian reopened on a Thursday. She was not bartending. She came in through the front entrance, not the service door, wearing her own clothes, a charcoal coat she'd had for years, worn in a way that had become comfortable rather than shabby. The club was quieter at this hour, the early evening crowd still thin, the space feeling less like the pressurized room it became at midnight and more like what it actually was, a large room with good bones and careful lighting. Hyun was not there. He had not been there for 3 weeks, and she had not asked what had happened to him, and she thought she understood enough of the answer to accept not asking. She found Min-jae at the same booth, same position, same quality of stillness. Black suit, no tie, the left glove absent. She'd noticed weeks ago that he'd stopped wearing it, and she'd never mentioned it, and he'd never mentioned it, and the absence of the glove had become a simple, unremarked fact. He looked up when she approached. She sat across from him. He poured tea from the pot on the table. The same oolong, she noted, and didn't say anything about it, just picked up the cup. "How was the interview?" he said. "How did you know about the interview?" A pause that contained approximately 6 different answers he chose not to give. "How was it?" "Good," she said. "They want me for the Yongsan restoration project, the old station complex." She looked at the cup. "I start in 2 weeks." Something moved in his face, small and genuine. "And the debt," he said. 6 weeks. The lawyer says it's clean." She paused. "Thank you. I know you said it wasn't charity. I know, but it was still something." She met his eyes. "I'm saying thank you for the something." He was quiet. Then, "You're welcome." The club filled slowly around them, the evening accumulating its usual density of sound and presence. She watched the room, and he watched the room, and between them the tea cooled and the music started, something slow coming through the speakers above the bar, and the city outside continued in its enormous, indifferent way. "Park," she said after a while. "He's working in Busan," Min-jae said. "Administrative work. For an organization I have no direct connection to." A pause. "His sister as well." She nodded. "Junho signed the documentation," he said, "through the judge, last Tuesday. The Yoido corridor arrangement is formal. Is it holding? 3 weeks is not long enough to know if something holds." He looked at his tea. "But the first 3 weeks usually indicate the shape of what follows." "And Byung-chul?" "He's in Busan," Min-jae said. "The organizations there have him on a specific kind of notice that will occupy his attention indefinitely." Another pause. "He is not dead. I made that decision again, and I understand it may be the same mistake twice. But I made it." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because the first time I let him live, I told myself it was so he wouldn't define everything that came after," he said. "This time—" He stopped, turned the cup in his hands. "This time I let him live because killing him would have required me to be something I was in the process of not being anymore. And I thought that mattered more than certainty." She looked at him for a moment. "That's not a mistake," she said. "You don't know that." "No, but it's not the same mistake. The first time was avoidance. This time you knew the risk and made the call anyway." She paused. "Those are different things." He considered this. "You've been reading organizational theory." "I've been reading people," she said. "I've been doing it my whole life. I just stopped trusting the reading for a while." The music shifted overhead, something with a little more movement to it, and the bar filled around them with the ordinary life of a Thursday evening, people with ordinary complications and ordinary desires occupying a beautiful underground room in Seoul. The magnetic locks on the doors were in their default open position. She knew, because she had looked, that they were still there. The mechanism unchanged, the capability intact, just not currently in use. She reached across the table, not dramatically, just placed her hand over his, the scarred hand, the one with the fresh cut still healing, and left it there. And he looked at her hand on his hand, and then he looked at her, and what was in his face was the specific expression of someone for whom something is simple for the first time in a very long time, and who is uncertain how to hold simple, and who is learning. Outside, Seoul did what Seoul did, perpetual and neon-lit and rain-soaked and moving in every direction simultaneously, a city too large for any one person's damage to diminish, too alive to notice the small, specific recoveries happening inside its buildings and its underground rooms and its borrowed dresses and its tea going cold. Inside Club Obsidian, the most feared man in the city sat across from a woman who had spent 2 years being convinced she was nobody, and he held her hand back, and the music played, and the night came down outside, and the doors stayed open.